Action. Order. Good morning, and thank you very much for coming along to the lovely environs of Stirling University. This is part of our sustainable employment inquiry, and I think you've both been very helpful when we were looking at this in the last session of Parliament. Maybe just for the record, to state who you are, who you represent, and anything of way of a short introductory statement. We'll start with you, Ms. Finer.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me back, and it's really helpful to be able to talk to you about sustainable employment. I'm Leila Tyner. I work for Disability Agenda Scotland. We're a coalition of disability charities, and I think the main things we really just very briefly wanted to flag with you is that there are, as you're probably aware, quite a lot of people who, despite relatively low unemployment, are still keen to be in work, even if they're not, and want to work. And that might be full-time work, it might be part-time, or even voluntary. And we believe quite strongly that more could be done to support people into employment and appropriate employment. There's anecdotal evidence of discrimination against disabled people, and we believe more could be looked at into that. And more can be done to support employers to employ disabled people and other hard-to-reach groups, in terms of making it easier to access tools, and also making them aware of the tools that are available. Some of that would require additional funding, but the investment would be worthwhile. And also just to flag kind of preparatory work around education and skills is something that comes up quite a lot in terms of people who are quite far away from the jobs market.
Mr. Gowans.
My name is Rob Gowans. I'm a policy officer at Citizens Advice Scotland. I guess our main interest in this area is that we're one of the largest providers of independent advice on problems at work. Last year, the CAB Service in Scotland advised people on around 45,000 issues related to employment and employment problems. We've done a amount of policy work over the last 2 or 3 years on some of the problems that people see, issues with misuse of zero-hours contracts and other areas, and some suggestions for how policy can be improved in those areas.
Grateful, and we're very grateful to you, Mr. Gowans, for the many significant reports you've done on this issue across the past years. Just in light of the work that you've done, you've stated that new forms of employment relationships have put a strain on existing employment protections. How has that been the case?
So, we've seen new forms of employment that are quite precarious. Zero-hours contracts being an example. We don't necessarily have an objection to sort of zero-hours contracts in and of themselves. What we're concerned about is how they can be used to either as a discipline tool. For instance, if someone isn't guaranteed hours, then employers can basically stop giving them shifts if they're displeased with them without having to go through any sort of redundancy or disciplinary process. Also cause deprivation and hardship if due to the unpredictable nature of the work. There are other areas such as the rise in self-employment, and concerned about some of the areas where people would prefer a more stable or traditional form employment, but listed as independent contractors. In the past, we've seen issues where it's affected people's tax status, and also where if people are coming for advice on what their rights at work can be, their status in law is quite unclear. There's a distinction at the moment between employees and workers in law and self-employed people, all of whom have slightly different sort of basic rights guaranteed in law. So you can sometimes find that whereas what the arrangement is in practice is to be what we would consider an employee-employer relationship, because of the contractual status that somebody has, they might be not be entitled to some basic rights to holiday, and that can take quite a while to unpick. So I think there's some areas where the law may need to be reviewed to take account of some of the changing nature of these relationships.
I mean, we're looking obviously at the employment environment in Scotland. In your view, do you think there's any particular issues that we've got to be aware of in Scotland, which is perhaps different to the rest of the United Kingdom?
I guess some of the it's somewhat difficult to tell exactly the extent of the difficulties. Certainly, sort of 0 hours contracts have been a sort of prevalent issue over the last few years for us. We're still trying to figure out the impact of the kind of so-called gig economy in terms of the self-employed, because that's not been something that's kind of, I suppose, come up as in as large numbers at CABs as problems with 0 hours contracts and more problems with work have been. In terms of what we've kind of seen in terms of the last few years is that there's been a rise in issues related to pay and entitlements at work. This can be things like people not receiving their kind of final pay packet after leaving employment, or where there's a dispute over unpaid wages, which was particularly difficult when employment tribunal fees were enforced, because in many cases it wasn't worth people's while taking a case to tribunal, because the amount that they were owed in unpaid wages was less than it would have cost in employment tribunal fees. This tends to be found around kind of holiday pay and sick pay, and people not necessarily being aware of what their rights are to paid holiday, particularly where if they're on a kind of a short hours or a 0 hours arrangement, that a couple of years ago we did a sort of short campaign to sort of promote people's awareness of their rights at work, and particularly that.
Just on that, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work around 0 hours contract, and the committee have had an opportunity to have a look at all of this. Is there any way that you could suggest that people who are on 0 hours contracts have an opportunity to assert their rights? Is there any way that they could take this forward, and what can people who are on 0 hour contracts do in order to try and ensure that they will be able to look after their interests?
I think there's a few things that people can do. Firstly, that despite their contractual arrangement, it might be that they are, at the very least, people are entitled to basic rights at work. Depending on the nature of the employment relationship, then if somebody is in practice working regular hours, then that might change their status. As I say, it's sort of quite a complicated system. One of the things that we would recommend is that government would have a look at the balance of rights between workers and employees, and indeed whether that distinction needs to be the case. In terms of specifically on 0 hours contracts themselves, we'd like to see a right to request a permanent contract if the 0 hours relationship isn't what the employee would want. Because I think there's that sort of the flexibility in an employment relationship needs to be on both sides if it's a flexible arrangement.
This last one has been, we've heard from a number of organisations, and there has been this view that there's the people who actually think that 0 hours contracts are useful in terms of their own lifestyle, and just the means to enter into the workplace. Have you found any examples of that? What's your view on that?
I think that there are no doubt that there are situations where that sort of thing will suit people. The examples that springs to mind is of someone who is who's retired but like to sort of pick up some work every now and again. Thinking of who would work for as a driving tour buses in the Highlands, and there's occasional sort of seasonal work, and if there's work, then the employer would contact them to see if they were available. I think where the kind of problematic situation rises is if kind of 0 hours contracts are used sort of in lieu of what we would normally as other fixed part-time or full-time employments, and that the kind of fluctuations in people's work patterns can cause difficulties in people into quite forms of hardship and getting into debt, or in some cases having to be referred for food parcels because they haven't received any work during the last few weeks. So I think there's definitely situations where it would suit people, but in situations where it doesn't suit the person, then I'd like to see them be able to have a statutory right to request a more permanent arrangement.
Thank you. Danielle Rowley.
Lila, you said in your introduction about anecdotal discrimination. Disability Agenda Scotland has stated that there are cases of discrimination in employment which are taken forward, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. If workers are being discriminated against, why do you think they're not taking any action?
So it's a combination of things as ever. And the only reason I say anecdotal is because people aren't taking it forward. It's really difficult to measure. If people aren't progressing with it, it's not necessarily showing in the figures. It just comes through that people are experiencing that. And some of it can be, say if they're in a rural environment, it's somebody on their street or someone they know that they feel they didn't get offered a job because of a disability. And sometimes it's difficult as well, even if that's not in that environment, that it's perception. And they believe that they should have been offered a job, and they've explored it further. And again, some of it's perception, it's shades of grey, it's difficulty in applying for certain roles. But people do find it challenging in terms of getting the feedback and properly understanding why they might not have been given a particular role or even an interview. Does that answer your question?
How maybe then, I suppose, use anecdotal evidence or try and have a grasp of the figures of discrimination if official complaints are made?
So we're putting out some research in a couple of weeks' time, which we'll share with the committee, which is looking at the barriers to employment for disabled people, and specifically around the disability employment gap, which is something the UK government and the Scottish government has talked about halving or at least reducing. There's potentially room for more research around discrimination. I know the Scottish government was looking at setting up a disability legal hub to enable people who thought they had been discriminated against to look at legal action, or if it wasn't necessarily legal action, could it be more mediation or exploring it further? But as I say, I think beyond discrimination, there are clearer barriers around, is it fear on the part of employers, say? So Scottish Chamber of Commerce did a report a few years ago that's really interesting, where they surveyed their members around did they employ a disabled person, and if not, why not? What were their concerns, or had they thought about it? And it highlighted almost caution or fear almost. And I think where we're coming from is not to demonise employers, but to look at why is that? Is that because they're not aware of things like access to work and funding for reasonable adjustments? Is it because they don't believe somebody could do the job, which in some cases might well be the case? So I think beyond looking at the figures for discrimination, there are things that we know would help, which is working with employers, supporting them, making them aware of what's available, and working with disabled people to get into employment. Thank you.
Lynn, in a similar vein, I think most people recognise that the legislation as written provides the intention of outlawing discrimination on the grounds of disability, but you've said that more needs to be done to make that work in practice. Maybe I'm asking for a sneak preview of future reports, but in terms of government action, can you indicate some specific things that would constitute what that more is that needs to be done?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, the more that needs to be done isn't necessarily around legal discrimination cases at the moment. More could be done to help people into work more positively in terms of letting them know what jobs are available, providing the tools, because some people are just far away from the jobs market, and helping employers. So almost more of a carrot approach. In terms of discrimination,
How could that be done?
how could that be done? I think it's a greater investment in employment programmes. So some employment programmes have been devolved or in the process. There's an extra £10 million for them around disabled people, but actually to really change the number of people in employment and therefore reduce the benefits bill, arguably, really putting some money behind it. And in terms of measuring outcomes, it not just being about somebody getting a job, it being, are they getting nearer to getting a job, whether that's education, training. Other ways would be to promote access to work more from the UK level and at the Scottish level. So access to work is a way that the UK government funds tools that people might need to do their job. So whether it's an extra screen, it's a braille reader, it's a ramp because they've got a wheelchair. It's been described by the Work and Pensions Select Committee as the UK government's best kept secret. It's time and again been called to be better promoted because businesses and disabled people just aren't aware it's there. And even when they are aware it's there, it's quite bureaucratic. So just making it a little bit easier for people to access that in a timely way so that it doesn't put employers off employing them would be a massive help. Those are a couple of things, I think. The other ones that we've got are around targets being set. So there have been some nice words about reducing the disability employment gap, but very little progress has been made. And for some groups, like people with visual impairment, fewer people are actually employed than they were a few years ago. So actually being more proactive about setting targets. So it was a 2015 Conservative manifesto commitment to halve the disability employment gap. And last year, the Scottish Government also said they would at least halve the disability employment gap, but without really being clear about how and when that's going to be achieved, we don't think progress would be made. And there's also a role for the public sector. So the public sector could set targets on how many disabled people, for instance, they were going to employ, because actually compared to the private sector, they employ fewer as a percentage of their workforce than the private sector does. And in terms of kind of taking leadership, they could set targets and also look at the ways of contracting. So in similar way that the living wage in Scotland, the public sector has been encouraged to use that in contracting in order to encourage take-up of the living wage. There could be ways around contracting to encourage people to employ disabled people. And it's not just because it's a nice thing. There's a genuine business case that could be made around that, around more people being in work, around diversity, around what those people would bring, as well as potentially their health and economic benefits to those individuals and the people around them.
Just quickly on that, I spoke at a Barriers to Work event recently, and it did talk, there was some disquiet at some changes that have been made to the Access to Work programme, and there's certainly a call from Inclusion Scotland for that to be devolved, the whole programme to devolve to Scotland. So would that make that easier, do you think, the sort of changes that you're talking about in terms of embedding it in procurement contracts and so on?
I think there's a general perception that it was a bit surprising that in the Scotland Act, when employment programmes were being devolved and various aspects were being devolved to employability, that access to work wasn't, because it's a big piece of the jigsaw. So that big piece of the jigsaw, whilst various other things have been devolved, remains reserved. So almost just from a practical perspective, making it reserved would make it easier.
Right.
And it might make it potentially around some of those changes easier to undertake and make it more tailored to Scotland and the needs. Because just going back to the point around the differences between Scotland and England, there are lots of similarities, obviously, in terms of the jobs market and economy. But if you look at, say, the Highlands and Islands, the jobs market there is very different. And actually some of the most innovative things that happen are there around social enterprises, people being able to be a bit flexible because they know someone, so they'll give them a job. It is a bit about the gig economy because, you know, various people have 3 or 4 jobs anyway, so there's some flexibility. But yes, potentially devolving access to work might address or make it easier to address some of those things. But that's not to say, whilst it remains reserved, we can't look at improving it.
Improving it, yeah. Okay,
Just on this, you mentioned a couple of occasions in your responses about the disability employment gap. Could you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and is there any sense that this is improving in your view with some of the new initiatives that have been brought forward?
So the disability employment gap is the level of disabled people compared to the wider population in employment. So it stands, the general population is about 78% in employment, whereas for disabled people it's 42%.
That's a big gap.
So it's a massive gap, and some of those people probably can't work.
Yep.
But there's a lot within that 36%. There's a lot of people there who do want to work, and 5 of our 6 members provide services to people who want to get into work. And as I say, for some of them, it will be, there's a diversity there in terms of the type of employment, whether it's quite senior, whether it might be relatively junior or low-skilled, part-time, full-time. But there is a whole bunch of people there, thousands and thousands of people who would like to work and contribute and are currently don't feel they're able to. And it's about how do we get those into work. And I'm sure you're going to go on to the Taylor review, but there was a really nice quote from ADACO in there about there being a business case for trying to get those people into employment. And the disability employment gap is that. It's that massive gap between the number of disabled people in employment versus the wider population.
And is that improving over the years? It's not?
No, and the figures haven't changed at all, really, in the last few years. There has been talk about it, and I think there is political will, cross-party political will in some ways, but not a lot of proper action towards it. And that's why we've been calling for targets, because actually we need to be transparent about how we're measuring this. And it could just be looking at the Labour Survey figures, and Office of National Statistics figures around tracking that more publicly, because there's been very little movement. And then within some groups, like I say, visual impairment, where traditionally actually more people might have been working, and particularly post-war, there was more of people accepted that disabled people would work, maybe because they'd come out of the war. That's actually gone backwards.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Christine Chapman.
I was only going to ask, just to go back slightly to the question about why it wasn't devolved in the Scotland Bill. Was that actually considered in the discussion with the Smith Commission? And how would that relate to the UK government's overall responsibility for disability legislation? Is there a balance to be drawn there, do you think?
Possibly. I'm not sure why it wasn't devolved. I believe it was considered.
Yeah.
There is a balance to be drawn there. It was just the outcome of those discussions. It did seem surprising to people within the sector that if you're going to devolve employability and employment programmes which have been or are in the process of being devolved, that access to work being reserved just complicate matters a little bit.
That was actually what I was asking. I was asking, is it because of the employment legislation being UK-wide, and that falls under the UK legislation, that it was, would there be any danger of conflict with UK legislation if it was devolved?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I could come back to the committee on that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. A lot of... I can't see what... I mean, there is obviously UK-wide employment legislation, and it also ties to European legislation, but I'm not sure that would necessarily negate access to work being devolved. I'd need to have more of a think about that, to be honest.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to Citizens Advice Scotland, just for a second. Citizens Advice Scotland has recommended the creation of an employment commission. This is to oversee the enforcement of employment law, as I understand it. Why do you think this is necessary?
We've one of the kind of conclusions we came to after all the various issues that the people will face is that there's not a kind of a collective body that has the responsibility for ensuring that that I guess sort of repeat offenders or rogue employers are targeted. For instance, someone who faced a problem at work, if they've been unfairly dismissed, if they face discrimination, can take that to an employment tribunal. But that's an individual redress. There's nothing necessarily to stop the same employer doing it over and over again. I think there's definitely a role for promoting good practice, which the Scottish Government's been doing in recent years, and was a welcome focus of the Taylor Review. But there are be employers who aren't interested in good practice and wouldn't necessarily take their responsibilities seriously. So what we would recommend is a commission to bring together reports from employment tribunals. It could have reports potentially on a confidential basis from individuals, from third parties such as CABs, and where there are nations, then it would potentially have some powers to punish employers who would repeatedly violate employees' rights. For instance, they might have the power to fine them.
So that answers my next question.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask how that would differ from typical or traditional employment tribunals. But of course, I think what I'm hearing you say is that they only help individual cases at individual times.
Yeah.
So this would be some overviewing
I
body.
think
Are you aware of any similar bodies that exist outside the UK?
there's probably the nearest equivalent would be actually, or certainly from what we found, is the Fair Work Ombudsman and Fair Work Commission in Australia, who will work together. It's not exactly the same as what we've suggested, but they would have power to kind of sort of really ensure that sort of rights are being promoted, and that if there's people who just repeatedly break the law, that there's some sort of redress there.
What sort of sanction would you have in mind? Have you suggested anything for rogue employers who are consistently breaking employment law?
So there's a few options that it might be that there might be fines. In recent years, the UK government has taken to sort of naming and shaming employers who pay people below the national minimum wage. That might be an option to extend more widely to really, I think probably the purpose we would see of this is to improve the quality of work, both by promoting good practice, but also by having some action taken on people who wouldn't be interested in I guess being a good employer.
Great, well, thank you. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to push a bit further at this idea of this employment commission. Is it effectively a new court that you're arguing to be created?
What we would see it as is effectively a sort of government agency that would bring together in the same way that HMRC will do for national minimum wage violations and for tax evasion. That would to bring together the kind of reporting mechanisms. It might be that they would take some of the functions from HMRC and from other bodies, but that's rather than necessarily, I guess, being a court, there would be a sort of an agency with responsibility for, I think, promoting fair work.
And what new enforcement powers would have to be created to be given to that commission?
I think there's probably, in terms of the ability to be able to, I guess, act on the reports that they receive, in terms of and having some of the powers to, for instance, levy fines, or to do to name and shame employers, or others in that, other types of sanction along those lines.
Which maybe already exists. Is that what you're saying?
It might be, and I think it's literally bringing some of the sort of functions together to take a wider view of the landscape, in particular if there's kind of reports going into sort of several bodies. There's other enforcement things there, that the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, for instance, and taking some of those together to see, is there a pattern with particular employers, or perhaps in terms of some sectors that can help drive up the standards of work and promote good practice.
Okay. I'm just not quite clear how it all fits with the, and if an employee or employer is not happy with how the Commission has determined a particular case, how do you foresee the appeal mechanism working? Would that be to the court system, or would that be?
Potentially. I think that's sort of one way of looking at it.
So it's still quite uncertain in terms of that the particular detail of what you're proposing. Okay.
Danielle, were you want to ask a question on this issue? Well, just let me ask just a little bit more just about what you're proposing with this commission. Would it work in conjunction with the structures that are already in place, or is this? Are you really proposing and suggesting that a new body is going to be created to deal with some of the issues that you've suggested?
Potentially, is sort of a new body that that I guess can potentially bring together some functions that already exist and some that don't. I mentioned that there is need roles for HMRC, for the Gang Masters Licensing Authority, for the various equalities bodies, but this would potentially have an overview of all of them. But I think it would be a sort of a new statutory body.
I mean, just talking about, we've seen your submission to the inquiry, and you say that more people have been coming to the CAB because of employment-related issues. Could you give us a sort of sense of just the scale of people who've approached different CABs in the course of the past few years, and tell us just a little bit about, like the range of issues that they bring to you?
So, in terms of what people there's about, it's quite a varied mix. As I said at the outset, last year there were 45,062 issues that we advise people on related to employment. The biggest being around pay and entitlements and dismissal and terms and conditions. In terms of some of the cases we advise people on are around sort of unfair dismissal, what their rights are in those circumstances, if they haven't been paid by their employer, and what they can do to get the pay that they're entitled to, if they're being paid less than the national minimum wage, if they haven't received instant sick pay, or there's rules about them being able to take paid holiday, if they've experienced bullying or discrimination at work, and issues related to that. So that's kind of those are the kind of I think probably the more kind of common things, as well as generally people who are coming in for inquiries about their rights. One of the things that we find that people often aren't aware of what their rights at work are until something goes wrong. So,
and this is what I was wanting to just ask just about that. As in your view, and obviously with the range of issues that have been presented to the Citizens Advice Bureau, are people now more aware of their rights in the workplace? And is this why you're seeing people prepared to come forward and discuss them with you?
I think there's as I say, I think they tend to find that that people will have, I guess, some knowledge of their rights at work. So, for instance, they might be aware of that there is a national minimum wage, but they're not quite sure how much it is or how it applies to them. And in some situations, they would come in. I think something's happened. I don't think this is particularly. This doesn't seem to be very fair. Is this right? Is it legal for somebody to for my employer to do this? And that's where the kind of, I think
and what's your view of the Taylor review? Do you think this is going to improve the situation in the workplace? I mean, we're actually going to be speaking to Matthew Taylor, so is there anything that you would want us to ask him in your experience in the last few years?
I think in general, we'd welcome the recommendations of the Taylor Review. I think particularly welcome the focus on good work. I think there's one of the things is that find is that if people are in a difficult situation at work, it can be an extremely stressful experience for them. There's some academic research from the University of Glasgow that suggests that that workers in sort of low-quality, stressful jobs have poorer general health outcomes and poorer daily quality of life than other groups, but even those who are unemployed. So I think that's an important thing. I think where we perhaps thought that the Taylor Review could go further, whilst there's rightly focuses on whether there's changes in employment status, is whether the dependent contractor model that they suggest is quite the right one. It's whether you would need various distinctions between employers and workers, and whether there will be creating another category would complicate the picture. We were also a bit disappointed at the time of the Taylor Review's publication that whilst it was critical of employment tribunal fees, it didn't recommend that they should be abolished. But since the court ruling, then that no longer applies, and I think it's quite an extremely welcome change that will help solve some of the problems that we see.
Thank you. Teacher Brock.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask Ms. Tyner your thoughts on the modern employment practices that the committee's been discussing over the last wee while, and how they either assist or indeed potentially hamper disabled people in their efforts to find work.
So in terms of modern employment practices, I think it does vary a lot. So in terms of greater self-employment, it does seem to have provided, for instance, has provided some opportunities for some people who have struggled to get into work in other ways. And it supports flexible working. So there are people who are disabled who've created their own businesses, social enterprises, and have been able to develop that over time when they have struggled to get another role, and it also has meant they've been able to do something that they're particularly passionate about. So in terms of kind of freelancing, self-employment, there does seem to be interest there. Obviously that can be quite precarious work in some ways. So there can be challenges in terms of people if they're coming off social security or welfare, or how they manage that, but there does seem to be potential opportunity around that. 0 hours contracts haven't come up in terms of when we've spoken to people. We haven't particularly raised it, to be honest, with folk.
That was what I was quite interested in, actually, just in terms of the preparation. It does take time for some folk with disabilities to, so with very little notice of work potentially being given to them. I mean, just how that would have, I would have imagined it would have been.
With 0 hours contracts?
Yeah,
or,
yeah.
As I say, it's not something that has come up as much, not to say it's not an issue. The benefits of kind of freelancing and self-employment has come up quite a lot in talking to people. Challenges of getting into the jobs market generally. And it being more people being offered part-time hours, say. So certainly we've worked with people who, like young people who are either, say, have got a hearing impairment or a learning difficulty and might be offered seasonal work at Christmas to work in a supermarket and stack the shelves, and then that ends after 2 or 3 months. That has been more of an issue that's come up, so that they can get a job then, but for a short amount of time, and then back to employment. And actually that's quite challenging, coming on and off benefits, the feeling that they could do the job, they were able to do it, but can only get it when employers are quite desperate to get as many people in as possible.
Aye, okay. So the Taylor report you mentioned before, I wonder, could you tell us what you think of the recommendations and how they might improve matters if enacted, of course?
So if enacted and if they are implemented effectively, I think there were 2 areas that we were particularly interested in and would welcome. One was around flexibility of employment, and the Taylor Review does highlight that is quite helpful for quite a few disabled people and also people with caring responsibilities. So looking at flexible working, which can benefit employees and employers, probably not through a 0 hours contract, but having some flexible working was definitely something that we thought was interesting and we would welcome being implemented more widely. The other one was around this idea of a pool of untapped talent. that the Taylor Review touches on, which is around disabled people but other groups as well, and almost the business case for tapping into that talent. And any of the recommendations that relate to doing that, we would fully support. But it is about it being enacted and it being implemented, because as I say, there's been various reviews and various reports that have touched on disability employment, which unfortunately haven't been fully implemented.
Okay, thank you.
Christine Jarden.
I'm just, if you don't mind me asking a bit more, I was quite pleasantly almost surprised at what you were saying about how modern employment practices and flexibility have actually enabled people with disabilities to become self-employed. Is there some way you would like to see that protected, that flexibility for disabled people? Is there some way, short of 0 hours contracts, that it could be protected?
I think in some ways, if it could be protected, I think some of it's quite cultural. It seems so more of an acceptance that flexible working can benefit people. So whether that's working from home, having flexible hours that are managed over a week, and that, I think we're quite pragmatic, that's not always possible, but if there are ways of protecting that, sure, within contracts, within conversations that people have with their managers, but some of it's just cultural, and people being aware that that can benefit would then protect that. But it could be enacted as well to protect that in law, which we would certainly welcome. Because some of that can be quite difficult. Cultural change is always hard. Yeah,
and if that were more, say, well publicised, would that help over the thing you spoke about right at the very beginning about the almost fear that some employers seem to have about, you said they were very cautious according to one report, and it was almost a fear about employing people with disabilities. Would that help get over that, do you think? I think they're almost separate issues, because I think some of that fear and the challenge that we have is people getting in the door to prove that they can do the job. Yeah. That's the main challenge we seem to come up against a lot, is once people are doing the job, or if they've been doing the job and develop a disability or long-term condition, that they can continue to do it and to do the job well. Whereas flexible working would help some people, and it might address some of it, but I think they're almost slightly different issues. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Tommy Shepherd.
Could I turn to the devolution of employment support programmes? There's widespread concern, as you know, that whilst the programmes are being devolved, not all the money's coming with them. I wondered if you shared that concern and whether you've made any assessment of the likely impact of what's about to happen, and whether you have any recommendations for us about what we should say about it.
So we had concerns about the money that's there, and that it was reduced. I believe it's being topped up slightly by the Scottish Government. We would have concerns about the amount of funding and how realistic it is for the level of funding for the challenge that's there. But separate to that, so there was an initial programme for 2017 to 2018, which has been devolved and the contracts were allocated. And then Fair Start Scotland starts from next year, from April, which is being devolved, which the contracts were announced about 2 weeks ago. And there has been some concern about the split of those contracts and how that might work. Some of that's just broader issues around employability and how you measure success within that, and the concerns that some providers might be creaming off the top in terms of just helping the easiest to help into the jobs market, rather than working with anyone who might be a bit further away to do that. There's some of the issues in terms of improving Fair Start Scotland. Wait for 2 seconds. Some of the issues have also been about coordination between Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Government and Department for Work and Pensions, because of process of devolution and challenges around different things being devolved. I think the key things that we've had concerns about is the awarding of the contracts and where it's gone, and kind of prime providers, and then more specialist support, and the level of specialist support has been smaller than we would have hoped. So the idea is that if you're going to really help people into employment, it really needs to be individualised and is quite it requires expertise with different groups. So someone who's in a wheelchair will need different support to somebody with a mental health condition, to somebody with a learning disability, and tailoring that as much as possible within those schemes is pretty key. And there's concern about how much of that's been recognised. And that was, sorry, just so that would be improved if the KPIs could be changed slightly.
Do you have a view, Rob?
I think that in terms of the employment programmes, yes, it would be better if there was more funding available. I think probably the problems that we previously saw, or certainly CAB saw with the employment programmes for people who were around, as the suitability of them for particular people, so that I think to echo Leila's point around that they need to be individualised and tailored, and around the interaction with the benefits sanction system, which is, I think we would consider that not referring people for sanctions in the new system is welcome, only because it's where we saw some of the with the work program some of the most unfair referrals, and that was partly because the contractors would have to refer sort of every example of non-compliance with sanctions. So, for instance, if somebody certainly couldn't find the building and turned up 2 minutes late, we would find that they were referred for a sanction. So that's a positive element. But I think there's certainly a sort of a lot more that can be done and would need to be done to make a reduction in the disability employment gap.
Can I just, one thing I would add as well is just in terms of evaluation of so through the employment programmes contracts are awarded, there doesn't seem to have been in previous years as much around looking at the results of those providers and evaluating levels of success. They have KPIs to meet, but really looking at actually, were they the best contractors to be provided? Could it have gone elsewhere? What are the best models for getting as much value from the money provided? I suppose because we're coming from the perspective that we think that individualised, personalised support is the best way to go, and by evaluating, that's what you would find. But there hasn't been a lot of evaluation from previous contracts, and in terms of getting value for government money, we would like to see that, because we believe that there could be greater value as well as additional investment being needed.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's right on 10-2. So we've managed to get through everything we think we needed to ask. But again, we've got, I think, another couple of sessions with this inquiry still to run. If there's anything further that you feel you can usefully contribute, please submit it, and we look forward to seeing the new report from. Hopefully that will be available before this inquiry concludes. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be in the next 2 weeks.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, and welcome to our inquiry into sustainable employment in Scotland. Maybe just for the record, tell us who you are, who you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. We'll start with you, Professor Findlay.
Okay, my name is Tricia Findlay. I am a member of and academic advisor to Scotland's Fair Work Convention. I also have a day job, which is I'm Professor of Work and Employment Relations at the University of Strathclyde, where I'm the Director of the Scottish Centre for Employment Research, and we lead a programme of research around improving job quality and workplace innovation. By way of introduction to the convention, it might be worth saying that the convention was established following a recommendation of the Working Together Review of Progressive Workplace Practice. established by the Scottish Government, but independent of the Scottish Government.
Grateful. Mr Richmond.
Yeah, Kenny Richmond, Head of Economics at Scottish Enterprise. And Scottish Enterprise is Scotland's main economic development agency, and our role is to support companies and sectors to grow in Scotland and to attract investment to Scotland.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gordon McGuinness. I'm a Director with Skills Development Scotland. I head up our Industries and Enterprise team. Skills Development Scotland, sister agency to Scottish Enterprise, and we're Scotland's main skills development agency.
Thank you for that. Well, we know that, such as the developing labour market, that there's responsibilities which the Scottish Government have at their disposal as well as the UK Government. Can you talk just a little bit about how you see these things working and what your specific role within the Scotland's labour market is? We'll start with you, Mr Richmond.
Well, I guess as part of our work, as I say, supporting companies and sectors to grow, and that includes supporting companies to develop their workforce, to encourage companies to adopt fair and progressive workplace practices through a range of different types of support and initiatives. And I guess it's really working with companies to help them understand the business benefits of sustainable working practices, good quality jobs, both in terms of the perspective of the employee, but also the business benefits to the companies themselves. So a range of approaches and initiatives to attempt to do that.
Professor Findlay.
The role of the convention is to, as I said, to advise the Scottish Government. So since its establishment in 2015, the convention has attempted to bring together a robust evidence base around the challenges of work in the workplace in Scotland and how that connects to broader labour market issues. There is, of course, a separate labour market strategy group in Scotland that deals specifically with labour market issues. But the role of the convention is to try to encourage a national conversation, to be evidence-based and to address some real challenges that affect not just the Scottish but also the broader UK and other economies.
I was just going to ask you that. Do you have much interaction with the UK agencies as part of your work then?
No, we don't. I mean, we're specifically in relation to the Scottish Government. Now, obviously, there are areas where the UK Government retains power, and particularly in relation to employment legislation and other related matters. And so our role in that case would be to take a view as a convention and to make that view known to the Scottish Government, and that view may but may not then inform the Scottish Government's response.
Thank you. Mr McGuinness.
We work obviously on behalf of the Scottish Government. Our activities are guided probably by three pieces of strategic documents: the economic strategy, Scotland's developing young workforce, and so that programme, and also, as Patricia mentioned, the Scottish Labour Market Strategy. Our activities fall into two main areas, I'd suggest, and that's careers information and guidance within our education system. So we have a large programme across all our schools around developing young people's career management skills, trying to make them more adaptable for the future, because the nature of work is changing. And there are other main services around the delivery of the modern apprenticeship programme and the family of apprenticeships, which ranges from foundation through to graduate level apprenticeships. So our main programme being modern apprentices. We'll probably start 27,000 apprentices this year within employers in Scotland.
Just on your view, because we obviously as a committee report to UK Government, and any recommendations that we do set would be made to that. Just who's primarily responsible now when we look at the labour market across Scotland for setting policy and setting business objectives? Is it the UK Government or the Scottish Government that takes a predominant role now in the areas that you work in? Maybe you could help us with that, Professor Findlay.
I think that's quite a tricky question, because the labour market, of course, is subject to a whole range of broader influences. It's subject to what happens in fiscal policy, it's subject to what happens in broader economic policy, it's subject to what happens in competition policy. So there's a whole series of other areas of work, of policy activity that impact on the labour market. There are clearly some important areas, for example, and you've talked about them this morning, areas of employment law, which are reserved to Westminster, and therefore part of what the convention has had to think about is how does it try to make an impact notwithstanding that some of the powers which might be available to any such body in a different constitutional settlement are not there. So the labour market is clearly an outcome of a whole series of interactions between different policy areas, and therefore the responsibilities for that lie across the Scottish and the UK governments.
Have any of you gentlemen got a view on that? Just what's, you know, there's in terms of, you know, particularly job creation and business viability, you know, but who sets the biggest trend when it comes to the intervention?
Yeah, well, I think Patricia's right. If you just make a distinction between law and policy, so obviously within Scotland we do have the ability to kind of shape policy to reflect the distinctive needs of whether it's local economies, whether it's sectors, whether it's individual businesses. And I think through, for example, the Scottish Government's labour market strategy, through, for example, our work with industry leadership groups across Scotland, we can get a good understanding of labour market and employee needs, and we can help shape policy to address that.
Mr McGuinness, a view on this?
I think from our perspective, the Scottish Government enables us to better respond to what's actually happening within the labour market, rather than the UK Government, for example. Actions that will be taken, so maybe use an example of what's happened in the North East around the oil and gas downturn. Yeah. And how we've been enabled both through Scottish Enterprise in terms of things like the Energy Jobs Task Force, and then Scottish Government providing resources for things like Transition Training Fund, which has allowed us to make a more robust contribution into how we respond to particular issues. Another one I would probably flag is the decisions that will be taken over Brexit will have a significant impact in terms of how the labour market responds. And
do you work together at all?
Yeah.
Yes, you do. I could sense that you're all communicating with each other. How do you come together and do some sort of joint work?
That could be through a range of initiatives, whether it's, as Gordon mentioned, the Oil and Gas Task Force is one, whether it's through working at the local level, through linking with local authorities, through community planning partnerships, for example. So there's a whole range of approaches and ways that we kind of work together. Yeah.
Good. David Duke.
Yeah, you mentioned the Energy Jobs Task Force. I declare an interest. I'm ex-oil and gas myself, and obviously a North East MP. Do you think the Energy Jobs Task Force has served its purpose, or do you think it maybe was a bit premature in being, don't want to use the word abandoned, but it was stopped a few weeks ago?
I attended that, the last meeting. The work doesn't stop. The work will continue. Our resources, if anything, are going to sustain. So we still have a large presence within the work that we're doing with partners. Things like Transition Training Fund, probably another year and a half to run on that. I think from the work that Scottish Enterprise had undertaken. I think because the oil and gas sector had been performing very well, there was, I wouldn't say limited, but there was an underrepresentation in terms of companies accessing services from the public sector. And through a lot of the work that's been done with engagement with the private sector and Scottish Enterprise, that's a very different profile now. So many more companies engaging in diversification programmes and much more collaboration, I think, around apprenticeships and training and those types of developments. So there's an undertaking that we will go back. We'll work carefully with industry to appoint leaders, whether that's through Oil and Gas UK or the Oil and Gas Authority, so that the work of the work streams is continued and it just doesn't fall off. Thankfully, the oil prices have picked up a bit, so I think you're starting to see a change in labour market conditions there, I think. So I don't think it's been abandoned in any means.
Okay. John Lamont.
Christine,
Christine,
Thank you, John. Just to go back to the point where you talked about the balance between Holyrood and Westminster, and you made an interesting point about the difference between policy and law, and the fact, I think it was Professor Finlay made the point about there are policies out with employment law which impact. We've had a lot of discussion previous sessions about the European framework that we work in at the moment and how that framework will translate into the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster after Brexit. Do you think that yours is an area where that will be particularly significant and there is a need for some sort of framework? If you bear in mind a number of employers, I've always worked for employers who were UK-wide employers, there will be a need for some sort of framework post-Brexit which enables you to continue working effectively in response to policies from both governments and to legislation.
Sorry, do you want me to answer?
Yep, whichever one of you think is most appropriate.
I think it's a very open question currently, isn't there? Because clearly there are some, in the area where I have expertise, which is around employment law, there are some important protections which have emanated, not all of the important protections in the UK emanated from the European Union, but a number of very important ones did. So the issue will become how they are transposed into law within the UK, and indeed whether or not that's something that remains a reserved matter, which it is currently, or whether or not that becomes something different. And at the moment, we simply don't know what will happen with that. I'm sure there are lots of people who will hope that many of those protections, which are crucially important and which you'll have heard in your session this morning, are not necessarily, even although they're there, producing the kind of outcomes that we wanted for them. I'm sure many of us hope that they will remain, but we don't know where they will remain and where they'll be located at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Richmond, you talked about the difference between policy and law. Is there a different balance between Holyrood and Westminster in terms of policy and law, or is it much the same?
Well, I think what we've seen in Scotland, for example, through the Fair Work Convention, through the labour market strategy that we've seen from the Scottish Government, I get the sense that there's probably more of a focus on labour market issues in Scotland than perhaps you see in the rest of the UK, which I think is obviously a positive thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could I follow up on that, if you
don't
mind?
Of course.
I think in terms of the extent to which policy attempts to engage with the workplace and what goes on within the workplace, which is very different from what goes on within the labour market. The workplace is not somewhere that's necessarily very amenable to policy interventions because it's within the private remit of employers. But I think that there has been an attempt in Scotland to broaden the reach of policy and to join up areas of policy to try and push forward things in the workplace. I a few weeks ago was with a group of academics in London at the British Academy talking about whether or not we should intervene to try and improve job quality, and there was a very strong difference in the room between people who worked within England, Scotland and in Wales about the extent to which policymakers were willing to discuss issues of what goes on within the workplace and whether policy should try and leverage something there.
So do you feel that that difference has in any way been restricted by, I'll phrase that a different way, do you feel that those differences are allowed to develop within the current, if you like, constitutional setup?
They clearly have developed within the current constitutional setup, but they have limits within and the one that I referred to you to in terms of employment law is the most obvious one.
Thank you.
Grateful. John Lamont.
Thank you. So my question is in relation to policy decisions and the need to create sustainable employment and economic growth. Now, as you will know, last week the Scottish Government published a paper on income tax for Scotland, and you'll be aware of the different views that have been expressed within that paper, and as a consequence of the publication of that paper, of how that's going to impact on the Scottish economy and particularly job creation. And I just wondered whether Scottish Enterprise and Skills Development Scotland, whether you fed into the Scottish Government in terms of the analysis before that paper was published.
From a Scottish Enterprise point of view, not that I'm aware of. No.
Likewise, not aware of it.
I find that quite surprising.
Well, I guess it was focusing on, income tax rather than specifically on the economic development or economic growth issues falling from that. But
does the rate of income tax not impact on the economic success or otherwise of our country?
Potentially it does, yep, absolutely, yep.
So will there now be some analysis undertaken on the impact of the proposals as outlined last week in the Scottish Government's paper?
I would imagine there will be a discussion at a board level in terms of taking a view in relation to the options that have been presented. But I think at this time these are political decisions that are being taken, and I think if we're invited to make a formal contribution, then we will do so.
Have you been involved in any of the conversations about the setting of the budget in the past, given that you're very significant agencies within Scotland?
Sorry,
have you been involved in discussions and conversations about the budget in the past when it's been set, given your role within, the Scottish employment scene?
Those are always active discussions in terms of the work programmes that we have. Our programmes are set out through a letter of guidance from government. But for ourselves, as an example, we have apprentices within the system, then that's potentially a 4-year financial commitment you're making to a young person if they're in one of the longer trade-related apprenticeships. So in discussions with government, we are also minded that we're looking 2, 3, 4 years ahead because of the financial commitments. So those are very active and ongoing discussions that we have, both in terms of existing business and other interventions that either we propose to government or from their context when they're asking us to make interventions. So those are ongoing.
So do you have a view as to how higher income tax in Scotland will impact on our economic activity and job creation?
It is not something since last week that I have personally, in Skills Development Scotland, I couldn't speak on behalf of our organisation because that hasn't had that conversation yet. But I haven't personally given that sufficient thought to offer you a view today.
And neither have we at Scottish Enterprise considered that yet.
But of course it's a discussion paper, so that's to be discussed.
Yes.
And Christine Jarman.
I was also going to ask, our remit, of course, is the UK government and how it operates in relation to Scotland. Would you normally expect organisations like yourselves on a UK level or at a Scottish level to be asked to contribute opinions or to be, for example, with someone from the Treasury to have discussions with CBI Scotland, with yourselves, about the impact of any changes in the UK budget?
Well, if there is issues where there's a consultation, for example, for a significant change or a significant new initiative, then sometimes we will be asked to contribute to a formal consultation. But not always will we be contacted or asked for our opinions.
And just for all three of you, how useful do you think it would be to have some input before budgetary decisions are made?
I think a practical example for ourselves and one that's had a significant impact would be the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, and I don't think there was consultation at a Scottish or UK level, so that's given a number of challenges, not just to Scotland but to devolved nations as well, and one that continues because it applies to companies across business. So we've now got different systems in place. And I think many businesses just viewing it as an additional tax now rather than as something that would have been, unlike the kind of construction levy, seen as a kind of positive step.
We've got a couple of... Yeah.
Well, how useful would it be to be consulted on things like tax changes beforehand or to have your opinion sought?
I think it's always useful to be able to share opinions, whether we're picking up views from businesses or from sectors around what the potential impacts of some of these large decisions can be, because obviously through Scottish Enterprise we can contribute quite a lot of our real-time intelligence to these types of issues.
Grateful. Deirdre Brock.
Well, following on from that, so you've mentioned consultation. Professor Findlay, the Fair Work Convention itself noted that many of the legislative powers, as we've discussed already, that are relevant to fair work are reserved to Westminster and are matters for the UK government. So I was wondering, given that, what more might the UK government be doing in order to ensure that the Fair Work framework works better in the future, or at least as well as it can?
Okay. The Fair Work framework has been established as a kind of multidimensional framework, so it's multidimensional in what we think fair work is, We have taken a very broad and quite ambitious definition of what we think fair work is, and we've talked about issues. So we define it as work that has effective voice, opportunity, security, fulfilment and respect. And that spans a number of areas which we would traditionally talk about in terms of job quality, but it also spans a number of areas around how workplaces are governed and how decision making around the workplace is taken. And so part of the ambition of the convention has been that we would engage a broad range of players. If anybody's looked at the framework, you'll see that we outline what we call the landscape or the ecosystem of fair work, and that ecosystem has multiple players. So it has government and policymakers in it, it has public agencies like my colleagues at the table, it has consumers in it, it has workers and employers and trade unions and other campaigning organisations in it. So in that sense, the framework is something that we think needs to be collectively delivered, and we think it's important that governments signal how they support that. And so, for example, that might be signalling that certain types of contractual arrangements are not appropriate or not consistent with fair work, or certain forms of decision-making within organisations or approaches are not consistent with fair work. And then thinking about what other levers are there to try and both encourage people to do the right thing and discourage people from doing the wrong thing. But the workplace is quite a complex area, so there's not a single thing which I think government could do to make the framework more likely to be implemented. We've thought about lots of different directions to do that. Sometimes that's encouragement and persuasion, sometimes that's using levers that are available in the policy space, and sometimes inevitably that will be how you use legislation.
Do you feel that there's a listening ear there in both governments, I suppose? I think the Scottish Government's fairly
we don't
clear, but
speak directly to the UK government at all, but there are areas, I suppose, where we would have as a convention some concern. So if I take the example of the recent Trade Union Act,
yes.
As a convention we felt that was inconsistent with effective voice in the workplace, and we made those views known to the Scottish Government, and clearly the Scottish Government made those views known in its submissions to that legislative process at UK level. So we were quite concerned that anything that undermines some collective voice within workplace would make it less likely, and the evidence is fairly strong, make it less likely that fair work was likely to be delivered.
Interesting, thank you.
Thank you. David Ducat.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I should have said it was we're go straight to 13.
Yeah, sorry. Mr McGuinness, this is for you. The UK government has recently introduced the apprenticeship levy. And as the skills policy is devolved, the Scottish Government receives a proportion of that funding. How has the interaction of the UK and Scottish responsibilities worked in relation to these policies? Sorry, I should say as well that the Scottish Government announced a new flexible workforce development fund to upskill and reskill existing employees. So how has the UK and Scottish Government responsibilities interacted?
I think from interaction, and I appreciate you'll get Mr Brown and I think Hugh McAloon following us, you may wish to ask for a direct view from them. I know from the interaction I've had with our Minister, Jamie Hepburn, there's a degree of frustration at the lack of consultation and coordination, and even now I think there's kind of practical issues in terms of the identification of who is actually paying the levy through HMRC, so there's been some challenges there. I think the devolved settlement, the calculations there's been more or less a direct substitution of the resources that we previously received for skills and learning activity. And I think the government has sought to build on programmes to fund, and there was a commitment that would allocate all funds from the levy to skills and learning. So there was a programme of work set out last December around that, and that's around the sustained funding of apprenticeships and expansion of foundation and graduates, a commitment to support the further development of workforce for early years to meet the commitments and expansion of childcare in Scotland, and a range of other measures. For the top of my head, I think the statement was made somewhere the 15th of December. The Flexible Workforce Fund was developed in response to the consultation exercise that the Scottish Government did undertake with employers, and within that consultation, I think it was nearly 80% had indicated that they would welcome some resource applied to workforce development, and that 10 million fund has been dispersed through Scotland's regional colleges, and companies can apply into that. The levy-paying companies can apply into that.
So you mentioned a couple of things there, like childcare, for example, that wouldn't necessarily apply to all apprentices. It's sort of not all apprentices would have children necessarily.
Sorry, I'll just clarify. It's actually so the Scottish Government's commitment to increase the amount of childcare provided will require probably an increase in the workforce of around 11,000. So that will be a mixture of apprentices coming in as new staff, and additional provision through our colleges as well. Mm-hmm. So the funding that I mentioned there, and I think it's around £25 million is allocated to training and development. Okay.
And just to bring it back to I've heard from some businesses in my constituency and across the northeast of Scotland, in fact, who operate in both Scotland and the rest of the UK, who have commented that they don't seem to get as much back for the Scottish apprenticeship funding than their English counterparts seem to do. Have you got any idea why that may be?
I think in time will tell. I think on paper the English offer available in England financially looks more attractive. I think in practice it is proven to be something slightly different. We've done a lot of work with the OPITO in terms of the programme in Scotland, and the combination of funding from ourselves and the Scottish Funding Council for the academic element of that delivers around £19,000 worth of support. Notionally in England it could be up to 27,000, but I think that's a kind of paper exercise, and I don't think it's actually going to work out like that. But it's early days, and we'll need to look at how that plays out. I think what we're getting from feedback from employers in Scotland is that we have a tried and tested programme of apprenticeships in Scotland, probably slightly more stringent employment criteria and good outcomes, and the kind of message back from many employers is if a system's not broken, don't fix it. So time will tell, I guess, on those financial elements. One of the other challenges, certainly in the North East, that many employers were already paying in through ECITB, so they're paying double levy, and that was certainly an issue with the oil and gas sector.
Okay, thanks.
Paul Massett.
Hi, Pam. A fairly quick one. One of the issues that there has been in Scotland for a little while, but it's becoming increasingly exacerbated, is a lack of good STEM skills from kids who are leaving schools now. And you mentioned that you do work closely with schools around career pathways and guidance and such like. And are you confident that the next generation of school leavers is actually going to be equipped with the skills that businesses are looking for, given that so many businesses, particularly small businesses, identify lack of actual real-world work skills as being one of the biggest barriers to growth?
There's probably two issues there in terms of real work skills and STEM. We've been working with Government Minister Shirley Ann Somerville, so there'll be a new STEM strategy published shortly, and that's been a collaborative exercise across Government, Education Scotland and ourselves. We've done a lot of work trying to understand where young people fall out of those STEM subjects. Some of that's around how the curriculum is organised in schools at times and limiting choice, and others is around that gender kind of stereotyping and young people drifting away from the subject. There's challenges, I think, in the areas in terms of supply of teachers around some of the STEM criteria, and we're working with Government around alternative routes into teaching to try and boost numbers. We've done some work in Aberdeen related to the people leaving the oil and gas sector. So I think hopefully with the new STEM strategy, which is pretty comprehensive and challenging, then we're going to be in a better place. But a lot of good work done within the schools, but it's trying to get that done on a more consistent basis across the patch, and better understand, as I said, where young people are actually falling out the system. The attainment gap that exists in Scotland is particularly relevant to STEM-related subjects, and again, that's been a big focus for Mr Spinney and some of the changes that he's making within the education system.
Can I just ask a more general question? I think some of you were in for the session that we heard from the Citizens Advice Bureau particularly, and they've raised a number of issues about their concerns about unfair employment practices. And given that you work with employers and employees, do you think this is a significant issue that needs to be properly addressed in Scotland? Maybe you could help us, Professor Findlay.
I think it's a significant issue that needs to be addressed in the UK. So we have very individualised remedies for problems of employment practices. So we can be talking a second about the nature of some changes in employment practices which some people are finding quite difficult. But how we deal with those, so how traditionally people would have dealt with challenges in their employment relationship either through a trade union mechanism or through a legal mechanism. Reducing numbers of trade union recognition across the UK means that that's not something that's available to people in workplaces. Until very recently, employment tribunal fees were massively prohibitive of individuals to try and to do something about those challenges that they face. Even with the removal of fees following the recent ruling, it's still a very difficult process. So if you as an individual, and we heard a colleague sitting where I'm sitting this morning talking about individuals with disabilities, sometimes simply don't choose to do that, to take that legal remedy, because it's not just about fees, it's about the challenges therein. Even if you get to, I've been an employment tribunal lay judge for 20 years, even if you get a ruling, it's not necessarily always enforced. It's really difficult at a UK level, and there's evidence across the UK of how many people who get an employment tribunal ruling never have it enforced. So they incur the cost, they incur the trauma, and in the end nothing happens. There are employers who are in effect serial abusers. So they appear at tribunal again and again. There is no mechanism for doing anything about that because it's all individually driven. So there is no way in which that gets tackled or targeted.
And do you recognise some of the things that CAB have been telling us about not getting paid for sick leave, for holiday pay, issues to do with harassment in the workplace? Is this something that you see as prevalent in Scottish workplaces?
It's prevalent. Prevalent's the wrong word because I don't think it implies to across the whole population. But I think there are pockets of activity and types of activity which are affecting some groups more than others. So when we looked at our evidence and our consultation, we consulted across a broad range of groups for a year. If you are in a category where you're disadvantaged in one element of our framework, so you're in insecure work, you're more likely to have little opportunity associated with that insecure work. You're less likely to have what we would consider respect at work. You're less likely to have access to training. So one of the difficulties is if you're at the bottom end of the labour market or a disadvantaged section of the labour market, you don't just have problems accessing work. Once you get into work, the quality of that work tends, other things being equal, to be lower. So you tend to get multiple interactions where you don't get a good job in the first place. It's insecure, you churn in and out of it, it's less good for your health, it tends to be less fulfilling, you tend to have less voice, and those things tend to stack up. And there are no obvious places for people to go to remedy that. So people go to Citizens Advice, and we heard a lot from people who would have been at the edge of their sanity without the support of Citizens Advice, and they do an important job because they are there to support employees or workers who can't get help from anybody else.
And I think all of us around this table recognise the importance of Citizens Advice Bureau. Certainly all of us at times would use their support and advice when it comes to these issues. But I asked them today, and I wasn't particularly clear the response. What do we do about serial offenders, employer serial offenders, when it comes to bad practice in the workplace?
I think I'm going to say what I said before in answer to a different question, which is we do lots of different things. So there isn't any one single lever which I think makes a difference. I think there is a role for naming and shaming. I think there are ways in which we might use public contracting to try and deter firms from engaging in poor practice. So I think we should use procurement more ambitiously, and it's part of the Convention's view that we should use public money as a lever. We should use our public agencies and the delivery of their services to support good practice and to deter bad practice. So we shouldn't be offering government funding to businesses who we know are serial offenders. There's work that might be done around elements of corporate governance, where you could think about how people are barred from being directors for being serial offenders in certain ways. There's work around how companies are able to self-cleanse in procurement exercises. So there's a whole series of different types of activity which could, and then there's the general thing which works very well with some parts of the business community, which is just to say this is not appropriate, this is not acceptable, and we need not to allow it to happen. And there's an ear for that. There are lots of businesses out there that will listen to that. So I think part of it is about saying promote good practice and show people how good practice is beneficial for everybody. Support people to improve their practice, and at the really poor practice end, I really do think there is nothing that you can do to some kinds of businesses or some kinds of business models other than to regulate them, because the challenge is that those business models don't just damage workers, they damage other businesses who can't compete with them and who are drawn down into the worst kinds of practices because that's the only way in which they can compete. So I think that that's an area where we really need to be more robust about how we challenge that.
Any of you gentlemen got a view on this, just the prevalence of bad practice in the workplace across Scotland?
Yeah, well, we find that for some businesses, they may overestimate the costs of introducing progressive and good workplace practices and underestimate the benefits. So quite often it's almost educating businesses that there are many benefits of that. And for example, companies that receive RSA grants from Scottish Enterprise, we encourage them to adopt and invest in youth policy. And every single company that we've spoken to have gone ahead and taken that forward. So that's a good example of how we can encourage companies through public sector support to adopt progressive workplace practices.
I think where we do see it, for a kind of zero tolerance approach in terms of we wouldn't provide any further support to companies if we were getting feedback through our training organisations or individual apprentices. I think the challenge is on Friday we produced our jobs and skills report, which I'll circulate to members. So we've tried to kind of break down the kind of categorisation of that, what we call non-standard work. So actual 0 hours contracts, statistically, I think it's only about 2.2% of people in Scotland are experience that. Where we have seen increases in non-standard work, so much more part-time work and self-employment. And I think it's that type of activity that makes the journey from being on benefits and welfare support into employment all the more difficult, particularly around things like the universal credit when it's introduced, because people don't know what their income levels are actually going to be.
Grateful, thank you. Christine Jardine.
I think you may have answered much of what I was going to ask Professor Finlay, which is whether the UK employment legislation actually meets the needs of workers in Scotland. From what you've said, I would anticipate your answer would be no. It doesn't in a lot of ways, that there are shortcomings with it. Would that be correct?
I think there are areas in which it doesn't meet the needs of workers in Scotland, nor the needs of workers in the rest of the UK.
Yeah.
So I think there are some areas in which protections are weaker than they might be. Mm-hmm. I think there are some areas in which, even where those protections exist, they're not terribly well enforced. I think we've ended up in a discussion which I think is sometimes not helpful around different terminologies about what we mean in terms of flexible working. So flexible working, people tend to, in surveys, say is a good idea. That's not the same as saying that particular forms of flexible working are a good idea. And I think that we get into a position whereby there are some real challenges around the evidence here. I spend a lot of time in my academic work talking about patterns and trends. So the pattern is that, as Gordon's just said, not many people are involved in 0 hours contracts. But some of the trends might be slightly different, and some of the challenges which those might pose on people are different. And we need, I think, to think about both law and policy as being something that deters people from using practices which an individual business might find beneficial, but which, if we consider the costs and benefits of in the round, what happens to the individual, what happens to the business, what happens to the broader society, that we might find are too costly. So a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that the Convention has done is about saying, let's think about the full cost of these employment policies or the business models that underpin them. And if the full cost of those is too high, we should think about finding ways to try and eliminate them. And the full cost might mean not just what happens to an individual who's in insecure work, because that's really obvious and evident to see. What happens to the business that doesn't use the skills that we've invested in, often publicly? What happens to the business that misses opportunities to change and innovate appropriately because it doesn't have the sort of staff that will do that? And what happens to the broader costs which are imposed on society? So the costs of welfare, the costs of taxation, mistaxation revenue, the cost of short and long-term health implications. We know that bad work is bad for our health. We know that it imposes significant costs on individuals, but significant costs on the healthcare system. So it's about thinking about saying, right, okay, as full costs of business models or employment practices, we should understand it in that sense, and therefore we should then be able to distinguish between forms of flexibility that we think are good, which are about employers and employees coming to voluntary arrangements that work for both, and we see lots of examples of that, and forms of flexibility which are not working. They're imposing an unfair balance on an unfair risk and burden on employees.
Thank you.
The Taylor Review. What do you make of it? What do you make of the recommendation that's been proposed? And do you think this will have an impact on employment practices in Scotland? Maybe start with you, Mr. Richmond.
Well, I guess it kind of goes back to kind of earlier points we talked about, and looking at how we get businesses to think more about their workforce as their prized asset, and how we get them to realise that investing in that asset will have benefits not only for the employee but for the business too. So I guess one of the good things about the Taylor reports is that it started to bring more of these issues up to the surface. We're talking about it a lot more, and maybe on the back of that we can do more around kind of raising the knowledge of how we do get better progressive workplace practices all the way through the economy. So for that respect, I think the Taylor report's been very useful. We
had trade union colleagues in front of this committee last week to discuss this, and they demonstrated their disappointment with some of the recommendations and felt it didn't go far enough. Is there a view that there could have been more out of this report and review, given that we've got Mr. Taylor coming to this committee in the course of the next couple of weeks? Have you got a view, Professor Findlay?
I do. I mean, I suppose I should say, first of all, I was very pleased that the Taylor Review said something that we've been saying in the Fair Work Convention and the framework for about 18 months prior to its publication. So it makes a similar type of argument. It talks about the importance of good work and why good work should be supported because of its broader benefits beyond individuals. So in that sense, that discussion being raised at a UK level is beneficial. I have to say that I was personally, we haven't discussed it as a convention, I was personally deeply disappointed that it didn't go far enough. I thought that some of its recommendations were potentially more confusing, so I thought some of the issues around dependent contractor, that's a complex legal area in terms of how you define what employment and worker status is. I thought it didn't say enough about the ways in which we could use the mechanism that was available within the discussion of Taylor. When we wrote the framework as a Fair Work Convention, we were not engaging with any constitutional issues, so we didn't talk about employment law. I thought that the Taylor report should have engaged with that a bit further. I also thought it should have engaged a bit further with how we build collective structures and forms of collective representation of a variety of different kinds that could make workplaces better and could make businesses better. So I was disappointed.
Mr. McGuinness?
I think the Fair Work Convention has probably went a bit further, and as a kind of Scottish framework probably has more relevance to ourselves. Patricia touched on the dependent contractor element. In a dim and distant past, there was a national insurance inspector, and I don't see how much of that is enforceable in terms of, it says if individuals want to work, flexibly, let them do so. I just think it's an area where could remain open to abuse. There's obviously some positive stuff in there around skills and skills progression and rights for individuals to do that. So we'd obviously welcome that.
In response to what is described as the gig economy, I mean, we had representatives of the gig economy in front of this committee in the last session. And has this been, I've got Deliveroo in Perth now, which I was quite surprised to see and observe in the course of the past few weeks. Is this having a big impact on employment practice in Scotland? Any of you? Mr. Richmond, particularly given you put a quizzical face on there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we've, and I can share the paper with the committee, we'd looked at self-employment about a year or so ago and the growth in self-employment and to what extent that's linked to what we call the gig economy as opposed to kind of, I guess you could call it true self-employment where people are finding new business and niche opportunities. Interestingly, most people who become self-employed, whether that's gig economy or starting their own business, are very satisfied with the with being self-employed. So I think it's whether the Deliveroo or Uber really is kind of true self-employment or not. I think that's a different discussion. But it's definitely a business model that has shaken up the labour market and has had implications.
I think that's what we found in this committee. John Lamont, the last question in this session.
Thank you, Chairman.
Sorry, DG was wanting to come in. Yes, sorry,
Professor Finlay, I just wanted to ask your views on the proposal from Citizens Advice Bureau that there be an employment commission given some statutory powers over enforcement. You mentioned employment tribunals and the fact that many of these aren't, the outcomes aren't actually enforced. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I haven't looked in detail at the CAB's proposal for an employment commission. I mean, I suppose I would come at it slightly differently. I do think there is a role for some regulatory intervention which is not legislation, but which is, for example, in the same way that we have the HSC or we have the HMRC looking after the national minimum wage. I think there is room for some kind of inspectorate that allows for investigation and response to certain kinds of employment practices. We don't have, unlike many of our European counterparts, for example, a labour inspectorate or a Ministry of Labour. In the UK or in Scotland, we now do have a Cabinet Secretary who has responsibility for fair work, so that's about as close as we've been able to come. But that's quite different from operation in other countries where some of those matters would be dealt with at that level. So I think there is a role for some kind of public body or inspectorate that would allow us to look more closely at some of these issues.
Thank you. John Lamont. Sorry, John.
Thank you, Chairman. My question was to Mr. Richmond. It relates to the economy of the south of Scotland and its particular ties with that in the north of England. And I just wondered what discussions Scottish Enterprise has had with the UK government and indeed the councils in the north of England to ensure economic prosperity in the south of Scotland.
Yes, so that's I think it's called the Borderlands initiative that's been taken forward. So Scottish Enterprise has been an observer on those discussions. So just observing what's been taken forward in some of the discussions, and with the new South of Scotland agency that's being introduced over the next couple of years or so, I presume that will take forward that in more detail.
Well, I wasn't actually talking about Borderlands. We're talking about the role of Scottish Enterprise in terms of promoting the south of Scotland economy, bearing in mind its links to the north of England. And yes, Borderlands is going to be coming as part of a growth deal, but I would have hoped the Scottish Enterprise would have had engagement with the councils and the UK government, given the dependency of the south of Scotland economy on the north of England.
Of course, well, obviously Scottish Enterprise works very closely with both the councils in the south of Scotland, and also looking at...
Sorry, I'm not being clear. It's the north of England I'm talking about. What discussions have Scottish Enterprise had with the councils in the north of England and the UK government to ensure the south of Scotland economy is as prosperous as it should be?
So in terms of links with the councils in the north of England, that would be through, as I mentioned, kind of observer status on the kind of the Borderlands initiative. In terms of the south of Scotland and the UK government, that could well be linked in with the discussions around, for example, whether there's going to be a growth deal and Scottish Enterprise advising on and supporting developments of any potential growth deal.
Okay, so there's no specific examples that you can give of where Scottish Enterprise have met with, say, Cumbria Council or Carlisle City Council or Northumberland Council about economic development in Scotland?
Not that I'm personally aware of, but that doesn't mean to say it hasn't happened, or we can come back to the committee with further information on that. Yeah.
Grateful. Right, that's right on 22 again. So thank you all very much for being so concise and on time. And I think there's a few outstanding things that you might be able to provide to the committee, which we'd be very grateful to receive and secure at your leisure. But thank you very much for attending this morning.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Well, John's got it's coming back to be John first. To you. If anybody wants to go for a very quick comfort break, we've only got an hour with the Cabinet Secretary. Now's your time as we're getting them seated. No, you come. They're all. I don't have any. No, just come in then. Come in anyone you want. Paul, just if there's anything.
Yeah, if there's any, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just.
Well, why don't you come in and 20? Keith, how are you doing? All right? I'm very well, thank you. I think you know most of the people around this table. Yeah? You won't know Mr. Lamont at all, you know, from your time in the Scottish Parliament.
Yes, I vaguely remember him.
We're just waiting for a comfort break for, is it Mr. Ducat and Christine? You don't mind just holding a couple of minutes, Keith, if that's okay, yeah? There's David. Right, order. We'll just get started. I'm sure Christine will join us in time. Cabinet Secretary, we're very grateful for your appearance in front of our inquiry into sustainable employment in Scotland. Maybe just for the record, say who you are, what position you hold, and anything by way of an introductory statement. And in that process, you could maybe introduce Mr. McAloon to us.
Okay. Hugh McAloon is the Director, what's the exact title of you?
Deputy Director.
Deputy Director.
Promoted me.
Have you not heard yet? No.
Not yet.
And of the employment?
It's Fair Work and Skills I cover within Fair Work Skills and Employability Directorate.
So thanks very much for the invitation to come along, and welcome to my constituency as well.
Oh yes, of course.
Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'll just say a few words if I can, Convener. First of all, just to remind the committee that I wrote to the committee in early 2017, and that was with the purpose of setting out the Scottish Government's vision and strategy for creating a growing, inclusive, sustainable and fair labour market in Scotland. And I also set out in that letter some specific actions which we were taking, and I also highlighted current and future challenges. However, that was early 2017, and even since that time an awful lot has happened in the meantime. In July, the Supreme Court ruled the UK Government's employment tribunal fees were unlawful, and that led to their immediate abolition. The Scottish Government had strongly opposed their introduction in 2013 on the basis that they would prevent access to justice for those in society most likely to require it. And over the last few years, the Ministry of Justice figures show a dramatic decrease, around 70%, in the number of cases that have been brought to that tribunal. So I was delighted with the Supreme Court decision and also pleased that steps are now being taken to refund fees to those who had paid them. And the Lord Chancellor stated last week that the UK Government still intend to charge fees as a deterrent to frivolous and vexatious litigation. I would suggest, though, that the Lord Chancellor learns from past mistakes and puts access to justice and the protection of workers at the heart of the tribunal system. For our part, in the meantime, the process is underway to devolve the operation and management of the employment tribunals, which will ensure, at the very least, that unfair fees are not imposed upon the people of Scotland again. It's my view that Scotland remains ahead of the curve in terms of embedding fair work throughout workplaces. So Matthew Taylor's report, which I know you've been discussing, the Good Work report, raised some interesting points, particularly in relation to precarious contracts. However, in my view, it did fall short in recognising some fundamental principles of fair work, for example, the importance of trade union representation and payment of the living wage, as opposed, of course, to the national living wage. This morning, I was delighted to confirm the rise in the living wage rate, which will benefit thousands of individuals and households around Scotland. In 2017, Scotland remains the best performing of all 4 UK countries, with the highest proportion of employees paid the living wage or more. That's 81.6%, which I think is a fantastic achievement and a testament to the work that's been done to promote the Scottish Government's Fair Work agenda and putting equality at the heart of our labour market. I'm also very confident that we meet the target of 1,000 Scots-based accredited living wage employers. But just to touch on these challenges, the view of the Scottish Government is that it's in the interest of the people who live and work here to stay as members of the EU and also, of course, to stay in the European single market. So we will therefore continue to make a constructive and positive case that protects jobs and rights of all workers in Scotland, including pressing for the powers we need to deliver the inclusive and fair society from which all Scotland's citizens can benefit. And I think sustainability, to go back to the committee's inquiry, is key to that vision, but we need to have the ability to adapt to increasingly fluid conditions, which is why we also now have the Strategic Labour Market Group to provide expert opinion on future challenges and opportunities. And with that, Convener, happy to try and answer some of the questions the committee might have.
And grateful, and thank you for that. First question, I mean, it's just with the division of responsibilities across the United Kingdom. The UK Government obviously responsible for macroeconomic policy, for skills and wider economic growth, where you, Cabinet Secretary, and the Scottish Government have responsibility for creating employment opportunities and the skills agenda. I mean, what do you see about the mixture of these responsibilities, and what options and powers available to you have you got to make a difference to some of the issues to do around sustainable employment in Scotland?
Well, in addition to the ones that you've just described, I think we are very involved, for example, in providing assistance to companies that want to come to Scotland, providing support to companies in Scotland, to encouraging particular sectors. We have the ability to do that through Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and we'll have with the forthcoming South of Scotland board that's to be established as well. So the picture is a bit more complex than that. We have powers well beyond those in the employment and labour market sphere. And of course, in the employment side, our powers are fairly circumscribed. We do have powers over skills provision, so we fund the universities and Skills Development Scotland. However, we don't have control over much of employment law, the vast majority of employment law. So to take one of the points I raised in my opening remarks, we would very much like to legislate for a living wage, a real living wage, and we don't have that power to do that. So it is a mix of powers. I think, to my mind, one of the most important things is, and it's a very good question, because if there was a broader understanding of the different powers of the two governments, I think it would aid the economic debate that we have in Scotland. We do have a very odd debate where, for example, I've been told that everything that happens in terms of jobs and the economy and growth is, in the words of one of my opponents, on my shoulders, where it quite clearly isn't. There's a division of powers between the UK Government and ourselves. So at least to have that acknowledged and better understood would be a good idea. But it is quite a subtle difference. So we have powers over, for example, Scottish Development International, so we can try and attract businesses here. And we don't have the full range of powers in terms of employment, much of which is left with the UK government.
What sort of engagement do you have with the UK government when, given that there is these mixed levers of responsibility? Are you in regular contact with your counterparts in Westminster?
I would say that it very much depends on the individual minister. So I met last week with Liam Fox, so that seemed to take an awful long time and lots of cancelled meetings before it happened. We've had quite good engagement with Greg Clark. Again, it's difficult to get the meetings that you need at the time that you need them, and that's partly because of parliamentary timetables on both sides. It needs really to be, there needs to be a willingness on both sides, and I found that over the 8 or 9 years now being in government that it's patchy and it varies from minister to minister. However, most recently, as I say, with Greg Clark on the industrial strategy, and he also has responsibility for energy and renewables, it's been quite a constructive engagement. Liam Fox, again, it was we have obviously very different views on many things, but relatively constructive engagement last week. And I always take the position that we should try and work together. There's a bigger prize to be won here for the benefit of people in Scotland. So we don't wish away the differences that we have between us politically, but I think it's worth trying to work together where we can do that.
I think there's general agreement with the Secretary of State who told us in this committee that there's a number of significant challenges remain. In his view, it's more important than ever that Scotland's two governments work together to help ensure Scotland's prosperity. Is there anything that you could propose or suggest about how we achieve that?
Yeah, I think some process things. First of all, if you take the industrial strategy, the UK government tried to consult with the Scottish government. We are not a consultee, and they have to realise what devolution actually means. It should mean working together and in partnership. And in some of the things that the industrial strategy seeks to take forward, it seems to me plain that the Scottish government should be heavily involved in that. One of the aims of the industrial strategy, as I understand it, is to address the huge inequalities that there are within the UK. So the north of England, if you compare, for example, transport investment in the north of England to London and the south east, it's a fraction, a tiny fraction of that. And the increasing imbalance there is. So the industrial strategy is meant to address that, and if it's going to do it properly, there has to be proper consultation. There's also, they talked about Shared Prosperity Fund, which will be the replacement for much of the European funding, which large parts of Scotland and, of course, Wales, Northern Ireland and Northern England will rely on, and yet there's very little clarity on that. So I made this point actually to Liam Fox last week. There's not a single recorded instance that I know of where the Scottish Government has been taken into the conference of the UK Government and it's betrayed that conference. So they really have to start loosening up and talk to us and let us know in advance what some of these proposals are. People across Scotland, especially the Highlands, but elsewhere as well, are very eager to know what's going to replace European funding. So let's have a discussion about it. Let's not do what happened with the trade bill, where I was at an SNP conference in a fringe meeting and got an email saying that the trade bill has now been published. That shouldn't be the way that business works. So I think in terms of process, there's a lot that can be changed, but it really does come down to a culture of trying to recognise the different mandates of different governments.
Grateful. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, you spoke about the desire of the Scottish Government to have control over employment law, and you want that devolved. I just wondered if you could talk us through how that would work in practice, particularly for UK-wide employers, and also those, which is obviously very personal to me, the cross-border employers who maybe have people who live in Scotland but maybe are working in England, or vice versa. Have you given any thought or analysis as to how much that's going to cost business in terms of the extra bureaucracy?
Well, it does depend upon which particular aspect of employment law you're talking about. But if, for example, you take the living wage just now, the different living wage in London, employers who are active in London, the rest of the UK and in Scotland seem to cope with that. They seem well able to deal with that. And also different aspects of employment law devolved in Northern Ireland are not devolved to Scotland as well. So I'm not saying we should do it for its own sake, and I do think we have to have regard to what it might mean for employers and if there was added bureaucracy, but it is possible to do. And nevertheless, I do believe it makes sense to have the full range of employment law and employment powers available to you if you attacked in a most coherent and effective way. So, yeah, you have to have regard to what it might mean, what it might cost, but there are many examples of where that's currently done. I was talking to a very large company, a household name, recently trying to encourage them to pay the living wage in Scotland. And he said, well, it'd be difficult because, you know, it's set at a UK level. In fact, it's set internationally. I said, well, you pay more than that just now in London. So how is it impossible to do it in Scotland? It is possible to do it.
So an employer based in Eyemouth employing people in Berwick-upon-Tweed, would they need to have separate contracts for those people employed in Scotland compared to those employed from Berwick-upon-Tweed?
Well, in the end, if we had the ability, for example, to legislate on a living wage, the choice would rest with the employer. If they wanted to pay people less over the southern part of the border...
The contract of employment, because obviously the contract of employment will specify which jurisdiction is applicable, whether it's the law of Scotland or whether it's the law of England and Wales, and clearly there will have to be a decision made by government as to which law is going to be applicable based on the residency of the business.
Well, employers...
the government's given that some thought.
Employers currently can decide which legal system they want to have a contract under, so that the choice would still rest with the employer. But in relation to the point I made about the living wage, again, the choice rests with the employer. If they think the bureaucracy involved is worth undertaking to pay employees less on the southern side of the border, then I wouldn't agree with it, but that's the choice that they would make.
So just some clear about what your position is then. If a business based in Scotland chose, in the eventuality of employment law being devolved, Scottish businesses still could choose the jurisdiction of the English courts for the purposes of employment law within the contracts of employment?
No, the point I was making that they currently do make that choice. They have that choice to make. You can't. It's simply a statement of fact that companies can choose which legal system the contracts are drawn up in. They can do that just now. That's possible to do that. What I'm saying is, of course, if Scotland had employment law, and if your example means the whole of employment law, which again would be something I would support, if that was possible to do it, then of course it's not an unusual situation. It happens in many countries around the world which are sitting next to each other. In fact, sometimes in much smaller distances apart than the ones between Scotland and, say, Wales. So it is possible to do. The question is whether employment law being devolved would lead to more effective employment law and a more equal society, and I believe it would do that. And I do believe that the infrastructure around that is not something that's insurmountable. In fact, many other countries seem to adapt it just now.
So there'd be no additional administrative costs to businesses on a UK-wide basis operating between both jurisdictions? It would
entirely depend on, well, are there additional costs just now for companies that pay a different rate in one part of the UK from other parts of the UK? So companies have choices, that's the point I'm making.
Thank you. Tommy Shepherd.
Yeah, just sticking with devolution of employment legislation, we're in the, well, we're not quite in it yet, we've stalled, but we will soon be going forward in the throes of Brexit. And assuming that Brexit happens, do you think that offers the opportunity to revisit the question of the devolution of employment legislation, given the number of employment powers that are going to be repatriated to the UK? And I wonder if your department's having any discussions there, or any input into the ongoing discussions between the Scottish and UK governments on either the devolution of some of these powers or the creation of a UK common framework within which the Scottish government would have some ability to argue for differential arrangements in Scotland.
I would say that discussions happened through correspondence, but there's not been the direct face-to-face discussion, because essentially that infrastructure, the bureaucracy of how that consultation would take place is not working. As you'll know, I would imagine from Mike Russell's statements in the past, even the joint ministerial meetings haven't been taking place. There's one to take place in December, and that would be the proper forum for discussing that. I've asked Liam Fox as recently as last week to consider the establishment of a similar joint committee on trade, given how important trade is. So we don't have that dialogue just now, other than through individual meetings and through correspondence, and there should be a format for that. You're right to say that whether it's consumer protection or employment law, these things, if repatriated, if that's the word, from the EU, the danger is that it rests, all those additional powers rest with the UK government, and I don't believe that's what should happen. I would say that in addition to supporting, of course, the bringing back of or further devolution of employment powers to Scotland, I've also tried to say to the UK government in one or two particular examples, there are situations where it doesn't make sense that the current disposition, I'm not talking about politically, I support independence, I want to see powers come to Scotland, the UK wants to retain those powers, but there are some cases, not least in relation to tribunals, for example, where the current disposition doesn't really work I mean, we should both be able to agree on the fact that it's not the ideal disposition of power. So even within out with the Brexit process, I think there is a need for a pragmatic discussion about where powers best lie. But yes, you're right to say that we are concerned that the Brexit process, I think you portrayed it in the terms of opportunities, which is a good way to do it. We are a bit more concerned about the threats that might come as a result from that. Some of the protections that workers currently have under the EU through the social chapter could be jeopardised if that power resides at the UK level and they take a different approach. But the dialogue, if that's the point of the question, is not nearly what it should be, and it should be on a formal basis through a ministerial joint committee.
Could I just follow up on that? Because obviously one of the arguments that's presented for not devolving powers in this field and in others is that the UK government doesn't want to create a situation that might jeopardise its ability to enter into future international trade deals, because it would want a level playing field, as they would put it, throughout the United Kingdom. I wonder in your discussions with Liam Fox or others whether this has come up and what your response would be to an argument that says Scotland having different employment legislation would somehow make it more difficult for a UK trading agreement with any other country.
Well, I think the general approach from the Scottish Government, as I tried to lay out in my opening remarks, is to currently improve the situation. So I mentioned the living wage. So we would want to get to the stage where Scotland's essentially a living wage nation, if you like. Same is true of fair work. We're already getting a lot of international attention for inclusive growth and fair work, and also the living wage. Now, if that is perceived to be the direction of travel of the Scottish Government by the UK Government, if their concern is that's pushing things too far, that's making it an unlevel playing field because we're going further ahead, then that's really for them to answer for. They have to say, why can they not do the same thing as well? It's not my remit to say how the rest of the UK should order its affairs in that regard. But I would have thought that those kind of things, being known internationally as a country that really champions fair work, inclusive growth, I would have thought that would be an attraction in terms of increased trade. I think it's an attraction in its own right, and also I think it taps into where many countries are now looking to go. The G8 increasingly discusses inclusive economic growth, so I would have thought it would be an attraction. My bigger concern is, when is the UK going to get around to getting involved in trade deals? I asked Liam Fox directly, is it going to happen in the 2-year periods of whether it's implementation, as some say, or whether it's a transition period? When is the UK going to start discussing these trade deals? So, and I don't think I've got it clear in my mind as to when the UK intends to do that or how it intends to do that. And given how long CETA took to discuss, it's hard to see how long that will be. We can't sit back waiting for 5 or 7 years to improve the lives of people in Scotland. So we're going to do that in any event, and I don't see why that should jeopardise the UK's position in relation to trade deals, unless it's the intention to have this low tax, low workers' rights environment, so you can poach trade from elsewhere, sort of bigger than neighbour approach. But I don't see why the UK should be concerned about what the Scottish Government's doing.
Deirdre Brock.
Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to ask about the Scottish Business Pledge, which you seem to have an ever-expanding group of businesses and companies signing up to. But we were told last week by a witness, head of the FSB in Scotland, there was potentially a risk that it could become just a tick-box exercise, and also that the employers who had signed up were probably already good employers, and he also expressed some concerns about SMEs and their ability to sign up to. I just wonder how you'd respond to that.
Yes, I mean, even if for some companies it was to be a tick box exercise, I would like them to tick the box that say they're paying a full living wage, that they're treating their subcontractors properly, that there's respect for staff. So even if it is a case that some companies are doing all of those things, I'll give you one example. A company I went to speak to, actually they asked that they speak to me about the business pledge. I'd met with their parent company in Canada, and they said they wanted to sign it, and they were doing all this in any event. And then when they looked into it, they found out that I think 3 of their security staff weren't paid the living wage, for example. So it forced them to examine their practices. I think there's also some other issues in terms of prompt payment, which is another aspect of the business pledge. So they signed the business pledge and were pleased to have done so. I do recognise that for some companies it's more difficult. That particular company had an issue in paying their bills too soon to companies from the Far East. it was kind of counter-cultural with some of their customers, so they're an issue with that, but they've agreed to do that in any event. So I think there are challenges. We have around 400 businesses have signed up to it, and I think it's a good thing. And the more companies that do that, even those large companies that perhaps already tick all the boxes, they're a good example to other companies as to how to do it. And the more companies that do it, the easier it becomes for some in the SME sector as well. If they're being paid, for example, on time by large-scale construction companies, that's going to help.
So there's a knock-on effect as well. Mm-hmm. And just with regard to the Scottish Living Wage accreditation, can I ask what you'd say? You know, there's been a bit of a suggestion from one or two witnesses, I think, that the minimum wage increase, there'd be difficulty sustaining that, and that ultimately it could potentially cause job losses. And I wonder what you'd say to that.
Well, I think one of the there's two real purposes behind the living wage, I think. One's a moral argument. You should pay somebody a wage they can live on. I just think that's the right thing to do. But the other one is an economic argument. And I've had this discussion with the Scottish Retail Consortium in the past, whereby they're very concerned that anything that takes money out of people's pockets hits their bottom line, because people buy goods and services from the retail consortium according to the disposable income that they have. And I've made the point back to them, well, if you pay your staff a living wage, they're not putting it in some Paradise Papers, foreign kind of investment thing. They're spending it on getting by on the goods and services that the Scottish Retail Consortium will actually be trying to sell. So it helps the economy as well. It's a benefit to the economy. And if we can get to the stage where everyone's doing that, then first of all, there's no competitive disadvantage to anybody else. But there's a big economic boost, including to those companies that you're talking about that might otherwise find it difficult. If their services and goods, it's like the old Henry Ford thing where he wanted to create a middle class that could afford to buy his cars. It's the same kind of principle that's working there. So I think the long term, and if you're at a state just now as we are with 81.6% of people in Scotland paid the living wage, let's just get through the rest of it and get it up to 100%. And I think every company will benefit from that.
Thank you.
I just want to check the number who are actually on the National Living Wage Foundation. Is it 800 Scottish businesses that have now signed up, and your ambition is for 1,000 to sign up for when?
The autumn.
The autumn. So you've got a bit of work to do then when it comes...
Well, I think we're well ahead. I think the last count I had was around 990. So. And
just for clarity, the amount of people who've signed, businesses that sign up to the pledge is 402 businesses, is that correct? And what are you doing to try and encourage more businesses to sign up? Are you actively going around and speaking to businesses and business organisations?
Yeah, every meeting I go to, so I was recently in the States and Canada, even companies over there which are active over here, saying to them, and also trying to lay out the benefits of what the living wage are and the business pledge. And it takes time to do this. We have had some criticism for opponents for 400, but you've got to start from somewhere, and I think 400 businesses that have signed up to all of these things is very important, and 900 plus. I mean, just to put it in context, I think the UK is sitting at around 3,000 plus, so that means that Scotland is almost a third of all the companies in the UK that have signed up to the living wage. It's a pretty good track record, but you've got to, what we have to do now is see what the next iteration, the next targets are to keep pushing it further. We know we've got challenges, for example, in the retail and in the hospitality sector. So I think we've got a very good base from which to go forward. I think the UK average now is 78%, Northern Ireland's about 72%, and we're up at 81.6%. But we've got to keep on moving things forward.
And we in the city of Perth are hoping to become Scotland's first living wage city at some point, so that's an ambition for us. Christine Jarton.
Thank you very much. Hi. Thank you very much, Minister. You mentioned the Fair Business Pledge, which has cross-party support. My own party supports it, and you aim to accredit businesses that pay fair wages, train young people, have women in senior positions. But your critics have contrasted that with the grants that the Scottish Government have given Amazon. How would you answer that criticism that you've given those grants to Amazon in contrast to the Fair Business Pledge?
Yeah, I think, well, I've had a number of discussions with Amazon, not least because of some of the publicity that's surrounded their alleged employment practices. Now, I don't investigate these things, but I've certainly gone to Amazon, I've spoken to them, I've questioned them on this, I've visited their facility, the one in Dunfermline at least. And I think it's very important that we have these jobs. So I think it was right that the grants, not just by the current administration, but by previous Labour Lib Dem administration, who also awarded grants to Amazon to bring these jobs here. I think it's right to have these jobs, and I think if you have jobs which are there currently, which people want to do, the thing to do is then improve the situation. So I've had a discussion with Amazon, not least on the living wage, trying to say to them, for all the reasons I've just mentioned, they might want to consider the living wage. I did get the response, well, it'd be difficult because we're not doing it elsewhere. I said, well, you're doing it in London. In fact, it's over £9 an hour in London. So it is possible to do it, and we're continuing that dialogue. But that seems to me the best way to go about it. Make sure we have these jobs. These jobs are sought after. Many places were after that investment as well, and Scotland won it through the actions both of the SNP and the previous administration. I think it's once you have those jobs, you have to make sure you improve the conditions for people working there, both in terms of the security of their employment and in terms of their wage.
But the grants themselves have not succeeded in encouraging Amazon, or putting pressure on Amazon to meet the conditions of the Fair Business Pledge.
Well, the grants themselves from both administrations were designed to try and attract the investment in the first place. I do think we are very conscious of public money now being used for purposes which are consistent with their own policies. But I think both administrations sought to get that investment in the first place.
Separately, the Scottish Growth Scheme was launched last year and promised 500 million in loans and guarantees, but it hasn't paid out any so far. Could you explain that to the committee a wee bit, please? What's happening
the
there?
growth scheme, if you're going to initiate something like a growth scheme with £500 million of potential support in it, then first of all we had to have the discussion with the UK government. That was always understood. And then you have to set up the mechanisms, which has now been done. And there are a number of companies, as my colleague Derek Mackay that had led on that, but a number of companies actively involved in trying to get, so that it's an application process. An application process is well advanced with some companies, and it will provide a huge boost, I think, especially to the tech sector, but also to start-up businesses and some scale-up businesses, and be able to access funding that's not otherwise available to them from the market. So I think it's a very good initiative. Obviously, it takes time to set up. It has been set up, and we're now engaging with companies that want to access it.
You haven't actually changed parliamentary procedures though, to allow the guarantees, etc. So when do you anticipate that you'll actually be able to, companies can receive the first loans?
Well, that's not dependent on change to parliamentary procedures, so that's why the companies are currently involved. There are different series of measures which can be provided. So some can be grant, some can be a loan, and some can be a loan guarantee. So that's the people that have come forward just now are not waiting on a further parliamentary process. If they pass through the application process, they will receive the money or the support thereafter.
Okay, and just to when do you anticipate that we'll see the first of these?
Well, there's two parties involved in this discussion, so I can't say for certain, but I think the ones I'm aware of are pretty well advanced, so I'd expect very shortly we'll see the first of those being converted.
Thank you.
Just on 0 hours contract, I note that one of the elements of the Scottish Business Pledge is not using exploitative 0 hours contracts. I mean, what is the Scottish Government's view on the use of 0 hours contracts? And we've heard a bit of conflicting evidence about 0 hours contract, where people have suggested that it's just flexible employment. What's the Scottish Government's position on this?
I think the key is that word that you've used, convener, exploitative. There are some people, there's no question, that find that 0 hours is something that they want. They want to have that flexibility. Our concern is where the balance of power in that barter, if you like, lies too far with the employer and not enough with the employee. So we've borne down on 0 hours. I think we've got less than anywhere else in the UK, around 2.something% 0 hours. But what we're very concerned, and this is consistent with our Fair Work agenda, and it might be worth, if you like, convener, hearing from Hugh McAloon about this as well. What we've said is we want to try and make sure the balance of power is right, so it's an employee's choice. It's not exploitative. It's something which is agreed between the parties. And in any event, we want to try and bear down on the overall number of people involved in 0 hours, because it doesn't provide the security that we'd like to see, and that's a big part of the Fair Work agenda. But I don't know if you'd like to hear from me.
Yeah, I would just add about the kind of definition of fair work. Fair work sounds like it's very much about rebalancing relationships between employers and employees, and I think there is an element of that. But really at its heart, I think what fair work is about is actually a partnership between employers and their employees to actually grow the business, create value in the business. I don't think you do that if you're imposing 0 hours contracts or low wages on people. I think if you can actually move those kind of milestones, if you like, around hours and conditions and wages are actually part of engaging with your staff, so that your staff actually start becoming part of that motor of innovation within a firm. So I think that's a key element. And, you know, as the Minister said, specifically around 0 hours, do we think that we're going to get the level of commitment from employees who have no certainty around their hours that they're going to work and what have you? Do you think they're going to feel like part of the endeavours of that company compared to those who have more certainty and a bit more of a stake in the company? I think when they're not exploitative, when the individual is actually keen to have, for whatever reason, the flexibility or whatever things that are attached to the 0 hours contract, then that's a different matter. But a lot of what we're trying to do around fair work is improve a lot of employees, but also really improve the competitiveness and productivity of the businesses that engage in fair work. So in some ways the name fair work maybe is a little bit misleading, but really it is about a new way of creating value for the benefit of the business and the benefit of the overall economy.
David Duckett. Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask about whether or not you considered all 0 hour contracts to be exploitative based on the language I've read, but I think you clarified that because as you recognise, I mean, I've been a 0 hour contract myself and I found it fitted me, for example, but it doesn't suit everyone, of course. But I was wondering, how do you actually assess objectively whether a contract, whether it's a 0 hour contract or not a non-0 hour contract, how exploitative it is and what criteria you look for?
Well, again, it might be useful to hear Hugh's contribution, but first of all, we don't have the powers in this area. We have the power to limit the use of 0 hours contracts. So all that can be done, as with many of the other economic data, whether it's job figures or economic growth, it's often survey-based. So we don't have the powers to do that just now, and it's, I think, a matter of at least a little bit of satisfaction, and in terms of the prevalence of 0 hours, we've managed to work it down through encouragement to, I think, the lowest level of the 4 UK countries. I'm not certain of that, but certainly it's lower than the rest of the UK as a whole, just over 2%, I think. But we don't have that data to say whether it's exploitative, and so that's why we're trying to do the work that we are doing through the Fair Work agenda and working with trade unions to try and see, especially in the worst cases of it being exploitative. And also what we can do is we do have the data and the ability to interrogate what the Scottish Government and its agencies do and to make sure it's no part of what they do. But beyond that, interestingly, we're about to set up a strategic board which Nora Senior will chair, and that will have attached to it an analytical unit which I've said and they want to have look at all the economic data that we have to make sure they're fit for purpose. There's a lot of things which are, as I've mentioned, sometimes a survey or a boost to a survey that are carried out. Sometimes the data is wrong. The UK seems to have lost £500 billion recently for some reason. I'm not sure how that worked out. The export figures that we have for Scotland have been proven to be wrong. We've had problems with the quantifying of oil exports directly from oil fields. So I think we want to interrogate the data that we have and make sure it's as fit for purpose. And the point that you make about knowing the nature of contracts, much easier if you have control over employment law in its entirety, but that we should be looking at how we can gather that data as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of understanding how employees feel about the conditions, the contracts that they've been given, I think it's why it's one of the important elements of the Fair Work framework that the Fair Work Convention have set out, is the whole area of employee voice. Now, that can be through trade unions or it can be through our mechanisms. But, you know, having an effective employee voice within an enterprise is the sort of thing that will unearth this sort of practice. So and it also goes back to my point earlier about that shared sense of purpose and endeavour within an enterprise. So, you know, having a strong voice in terms of how workers are treated is an important element of it, but also having those mechanisms for employees and our workers to engage with management to actually come up with better ways and more productive ways for the enterprise to go about its business is important. So I think what you're looking for there is that kind of moving away from a kind of them and us thing into a shared endeavour. And I think highlighting practices, I guess, that the workers in any enterprise find unacceptable and finding ways of resolving that is a key element of what the Fair Work Convention laid out.
Okay, thank you. Grateful. A significant theme in the evidence that we've collected is to do with new business models that have emerged in the course of the past few years. I'm just wondering your view, Cabinet Secretary, of the impact that this has had on Scotland's labour market, and if you've got any concerns about what you've observed.
Yes, Scotland's not been immune from the new business models, and new business models in and of themselves can be real disruptors in the economy, which can be a good thing. So there can be real benefits from that. So you want to keep yourself open to the possibility of new business models and to encourage them. I think some of the things that we've seen in terms of what's sometimes called the collaborative economy, we've set up a group to look at this. A bit
the
like
collaborative economy.
Collaborative economy, yeah. I suppose it's between individuals and organisations. So if you think about Airbnb, for example, even Uber, that's one term for it, is the collaborative economy. Now, we were not, I did ask Matthew Taylor to give input from Scotland to his report, and that wasn't taken up, which is unfortunate. So it was done without the input of the Scottish Government. But we have our own collaborative economy. I think what we're keen to do is to see where the benefits might be realised, but also to try and address some of what seem to be the obvious problems. And that goes back to the point about insecurity and lack of rights for a number of employees, if they are termed as employees, which we think they should be. So we want to try and tackle that as best we can. And aside from that, there are other issues as well in terms of in the Scottish Parliament, we've had quite a lot of discussion about the impact on the Edinburgh housing market of things like Airbnb or also short-term lets, whereby it's said anyway that entire communities within the city centre of Edinburgh can be pretty much taken over by short-term lets, and people are priced out of those kind of areas. So we are currently looking at that through the Commission, which is chaired by somebody from Nesta, and we will report that reports back. I think it's in before the end of this year, so we'll have more to say on it then. But it's quite clear to me there are, of course, economic drivers and opportunities in there, but we want to make sure that what happens for employees is consistent with our fair work agenda. And this notion of the precariat, people who are very precariously employed, or if they are employed, they don't have the same rights as others. I think that's something that's very central to our fair work agenda. And
notwithstanding your sense of a lack of consultation with the Taylor review, what's your view of the recommendations that's been made?
Well, much of it we agreed with. I think the aspects around people being termed employees, we would have gone further. There was no mention, for example, of trade union recognition, which we'd like to have seen in relation to that. So I think we would have gone further. We've seen it as a useful contribution to the debate. It could have been more than that had they been willing to have input from the Scottish Government, but we've seen it as a useful contribution to debate. But we will look at it through the collaborative economy group that we've set up, and we'll come to our own conclusions in due course.
Grateful. David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned earlier, Cabinet Secretary, the imbalance between London and the south east and the north of England, particularly in terms of transport and digital infrastructure. So bringing it back to Scotland, you can probably guess where this is going. We've heard during this and a number of other inquiries that there are significant barriers to the success of local economies outside the central belt, in particular digital and transport infrastructure. To what extent are you currently working, or do you need to work with the UK Government on these matters?
Well, I think first of all, in relation to transport, I would say quite sincerely, I think the government, which I'm part of, has done a huge amount, far more than any previous government in terms of transport. So whether it's the investment we've made in the ferries, in terms of new routes, new vessels, new port facilities, the establishment of RET, this has been a huge boost to those transport links. It's never done, it's never done to everyone's satisfaction. I understand that point, but we've done a huge amount to improve that and spent a lot of money in doing so. In relation to the roads network, then once again, I think we have the first government ever to commit itself to dualling of the A9 between Inverness and Perth, the A96 between Inverness and Aberdeen, but even smaller roads, as you said, more rural areas. So the Mustodloch bypass is perhaps not best known to everybody, but it was campaigned for 50 years, and this was the government which actually completed that. Also, in terms of rail, we've never seen such high investment in rail and new routes, new stations. The Borders Railway was the biggest piece of rail infrastructure in the UK for 100 years. So I think we have made the investment in terms of transport, and it's tried to look beyond that. It was traditionally felt there had been too much concentration in the central belt of Scotland. Also, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, I'm not sure if it still is, but for a number of years was the largest roads project in the UK. Again, that's been campaigned for 50 years. And actually, a former minister, Patrick McLaughlin, came to Scotland a few years back and said, your problem here in Scotland is you've not sufficiently invested in your transport infrastructure for decades. And he was right. He was a transport minister in 1989. That was pointed out to him. But he was right that there's not been that investment. So I think we are doing that. In terms of digital, and going back to your point about the rural areas, it's quite clear to me that as a former transport minister, people were very concerned about the road, rail and ferry networks. But nowadays, it's the digital highway that's going to be hugely important for employment, for health, for education. And we've got a big job of work to do. It's not my job in the Scottish Government to do that, it's Fergus Ewing's, but that's a big job of work, so that's why we made the commitment that we have by 2021 to have everybody in every business having access to superfast broadband. So these are the big commitments. They're not all able to be done at our own hand. Digital has a lot to do with the UK Government, but that does recognise the need for, as you say, local economies further removed from, say, the central belt of Scotland to be able to make sure they can have the same experience of economic growth and opportunities as everyone else.
I'm sure the businesses in my constituency and Bamford Buchan will be glad to hear that. But going back to a key part of my question, which was to what extent are you working with the UK Government or need to work closer with the UK Government or vice versa to try and push this along?
Well, one of the ways in which we're doing that is through city deals, and that might sound counterintuitive because you're talking about, by and large, rural areas away from cities, but many of the city deals that we've struck have been with areas out with the cities, so you'll know that Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire was a city deal. And also even in Glasgow, the 7 other authorities were not part of the city of Glasgow. So one of the ways that we're doing that is a city deal process. What I'm very keen to get from the UK Government is their sense of what they intend for those areas not currently covered by city deals. So Murray, Falkirk, Argyll, the islands, the Northern Isles, what is their intention to do there? Because, and I think, to be fair, Ian Duncan agrees on this point, that we have to have a coherent basis on which to go forward. And if the two governments can act together, then we're liable to achieve more in doing that. So I've made that offer to the UK Government. Let's try and work out exactly what we're going to do right across the country, and that will cover the entire, every community in Scotland if we can achieve that. But there is work going on just now, and the city deal process has been, I think, a relative success in terms of the collaboration between the two governments.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Christine, did you want to come in?
Yes, just a small point. First of all, I'm sure my colleague Tavish Scott will be delighted to hear you congratulate him in a way on Borders Rail, which, if I remember rightly, was his announcement. The Borders Rail link was going to be built. And I may have missed this in your answer, so apologies if I have. But do you have any real projects to link areas like Aberdeenshire more closely, and Inverness more closely with the Central Belt, say Edinburgh? Do you have any proposals to improve the rail link, which has been subject of a fair amount of criticism over the past few years?
I'm not aware of any Tavish Scott announcement. It certainly wasn't what drove me to actually do it. The first government to actually do it rather than talk about it for a number of years. But anyway, I think it was generally supported by all political parties that we did that. In relation to certainly Aberdeen, we are looking to improve the rail link from Aberdeen to the Central Belt. We announced that as part of the City Region deal, and particularly acknowledging the problems at the Montrose Basin that are there, which are a major inhibition on improving journey times. I think the amount that was being talked about was £200 million. But although I was the person that announced that because it was a city deal, I'm not the Transport Minister now, so I don't have that knowledge of all the different transport and rail infrastructure deals. What I would say is the recent announcement by the UK Government, which essentially limits or cuts around £600 million off the capital investment we'd want to make in our railways, will fundamentally, if it stays the same, inhibit our ability to take on new stations, new routes and so on as well, or carry out improvements. The major improvement we're doing just now is in terms of electrification. So Aberdeen to Glasgow is currently underway, going north to Dunblane, and then, of course, we want to see the whole of the network electrified because of the environmental and efficiency benefits. But you need the money to do that. And if moving from what's called the H-loss, the higher level spending figure to a new figure whereby it's not, sorry for the acronym, but the RABs, the resource asset base, which is how things were funded before. If that's changing from 2019 and it's been done by grants and those are substantially less, then it will affect the rail programme, and that's a discussion that we're currently having with the UK. But the main part of the improvements to Aberdeen, rather than Aberdeenshire, are through that example I mentioned of the Montrose Basin.
Thank you.
Grateful. You did touch on city deals, but I know John Lamont's got a question on this. John?
I do, and I'll come back to that. I know it's not your department, but in terms of what David was talking about earlier, in terms of digital connectivity, could you just outline what the Scottish Government's been doing on that front?
Yeah, so there's a number of things. Again, it is not my department, it's Fergus Ewing, but so to try and push out the rollout of broadband across the country, a number of different things have been done. So in areas where it's very difficult in the short term to see how that can be done by, if you like, the establishment of the cable networks, we're looking at other methods of supporting that for individual communities in terms of satellites or voucher systems to try and improve that in the short term. But it is very much, actually just now, it's very much if you like, a fluid situation. It's not going to affect our overall commitment to make sure that everyone's established by 2021, but the process of getting there will depend on the discussions which the UK government is currently having with BT and others about how the rollout will happen in England and Wales. So a lot's been done just now. Progress has been made. They've exceeded the targets they had up to this point, and the end point is still to have every business and individual having the ability to connect to superfast broadband by 2021. As to the detail of how they're going to reach that, you would have to ask Fergus Ewing, I think, John.
So these are Scottish Government initiatives as opposed to anything that BT or the UK Government's doing?
The Scottish Government's target is the Scottish Government's target. We stood in the manifesto to have that established by 2021, but the process for getting there does involve working with BT, and the relationship the UK Government has with BT will impact on the relationship which the Scottish Government has with BT. It's quite an involved process, and we want to see how that's going to develop for the rest of the UK. For example, there are different speeds being committed to south of the border than there are north of the border, so it is quite a complex area. And without trying to pass the buck, I'm sure Fergus Ewing could give you more detail more easily than I could.
That's very helpful. We will be having an inquiry into connectivity. We'll be dealing with some of these issues. Sorry, John.
Just then going to the city deals and regional deals, and obviously I'm very supportive of the Borderlands growth deal. Is the Scottish Government positive? And I think you touched on this earlier, I think I know the answer, but you are generally positive about these regional deals?
Yes, we've given a commitment. In fact, I think the Borderlands was first mooted by Alex Salmond. I could be wrong on that, but that's the first I recall of it being mentioned. And we've said from the start we're keen to see this, but you can immediately see the anomaly that is there. Scottish Borders have already benefited from a city deal. If we push ahead with a Borderlands deal, and we're saying we want to make sure there is a Borderlands deal, then that would mean that one part of the country's had two deals, other parts of the country have had none, which is my reason for saying to Ian Duncan, and I think I've got his agreement on this, that we want to try and think about how this is done across the country. If you have one area that's got two deals, other areas that have got none, then you're going to get some resentment for that. So let's plan it out in the best way possible, and yes, we are positive about a Borderlands deal.
And how much impact are these deals having in terms of job growth?
I think it's difficult to say at this stage. Obviously, the oldest one, or the one that's longest established, has been the Glasgow one. I think in general terms, you can say, well, the Scottish economy in terms of employment is 4.1%. It was down to a record low of 3.8% recently, so employment generally is very good, but it's hard to say exactly what the impact of those are at this stage, given the Glasgow one is, I think, 3 years, and some of the projects are only just now coming through. And Aberdeen's more recent, as is Inverness. So I think we'll have to wait a bit longer. And also it will be for the local governance arrangements to also report back on the impact of these investments as well, so the local authorities involved.
Thank you. Can I just ask on city deals, because we had Lord Duncan in front of this committee a couple of weeks ago, and I raised the issue of the Tay Cities deal, and a concern that there might have been about, maybe there's not been so much delayed, but there was issues about what Mr Lord Duncan described as the reserved space and an imbalance in the bids that had been submitted going forward. Is that a feature that you recognise, and what could we do in order to try and sort of correct some of these features?
Well, it's worth thinking back to the first one that happened in Scotland, Glasgow, where the kind of cast-iron rule we were told was 50-50. So you could government put in 50%, we put in 50%, and then you'd add on to that the local authority and private sector contribution. That then changed subsequently. The UK government changed its view on that to say that it was only going to be supporting reserved areas. They didn't make it an absolutely cast iron. I can think of an example in the Inverness deal that was done that was not really reserved, but the UK government funded in any event, but they've stuck to that kind of line. Now, if that is to be the line from the UK government, that means that local authorities and those involved in city deals have to try and have regard, if they want to increase the quantum of the deal, to making sure they've got sufficient reserved issues, because very often what comes forward is a huge list of devolved issues, infrastructure projects in particular, for us to fund. Now, if they do that and the reserved element is down here, then the whole deal comes down. So they really do have to think quite imaginatively about what they'll do in terms of reserved elements to their bid. And Ian Duncan has said the same thing. What I have said is, for my part and the Scottish Government's part, we are willing to be flexible if the constituent parts of any particular deal, you mentioned Tay-Cities, so it comprises obviously Angus, a bit of Fife and Dundee and Perth and Kinross. It doesn't have to necessarily, from my point of view, be 50-50 in each area, and I think Ian Duncan's agreed with that as well. So we're willing to be flexible in relation to it, but it does mean that those proposing city deals have to have regard to what they can do in the reserve space as much as what they can do in the devolved space.
Great, well that's really helpful, thank you. Paul Masterton.
Thank you. Obviously, a number of these big investment projects are long-term. Not all governments obviously like thinking long-term. They like things which are short-term and deliver quick bang for their buck. But in terms of budgeting for some of the larger capital investment projects that have been talked about and which will deliver the kind of sustainable growth and jobs and productivity we've been talking about, how is the Scottish Government going through that budgeting process for long-term investment decisions?
Well, in relation to city deals?
Yeah, and even more generally in terms of just single projects.
Well, in relation to city deals, you're bound by the deal when you strike it. So when we struck the Glasgow City deal, we're bound to put into our capital programme in future years our contribution to the Glasgow deal, as we've done for the Aberdeenshire, and also the Inverness City deal. So that's factored into the capital programmes for us already. It's a kind of baseline. It has to go in there. I mean, it tends to be the case, I'd imagine most governments will look at what their legal commitments are, contractual commitments, ministerial commitments, and what's discretionary. And those are legal commitments that will fund those. Beyond that, it's a difficult situation. We've had a substantial real terms cut to our capital programme, so we've had to look at different ways that we can boost what we're doing in terms of capital. So each year you will come to, and obviously the optimum is you can do it on a 3-year basis if you can do that, but each year we'll look at what's available to us. We do have the new borrowing powers, which have increased the amount we can put into the pot by around £450 million, but overall we've got a cut in our capital programme. And it just means that each year you have those pressures to contain. And that will not affect city deals because they will be, if you like, baked in from the start as they're committed to. But you mentioned long-term projects. The A9 we announced, I think, in 2012. It's a 13-year project. We're not going to get, well, I'm hoping it still is an SNP government by 25-26, but you're not going to guarantee to get a short-term benefit from that. We've just opened the first of 11 phases on the A9, but we think it's right for the country that we do that. So that's an example of a long-term commitment, longer than most governments have thought about in the past, I think.
Just lastly, because I know you have to get away, Cabinet Secretary, just on the UK's industrial strategy. We know they're consulting just now. I mean, what role are you going to be playing? What level of consultation do you expect? And will this have an impact on some of these issues that we're talking about when it comes to sustainable employment?
Yes, I think if we can get it right, if we can get the process and the consultation right, then we can achieve a great deal, which can also benefit employment. I think, as I've said already, when we did get the chance to discuss it with the UK government, we did point out there was no reference to trade unions, very little reference to employees, so we've made that point to them. And also, much of the industrial strategy will be involving Innovate UK. Now, once again, we've had myself and the First Minister recently met with Innovate UK, but once again, we find out something at 2 days' notice to give appointments to a board, and then they're not told who's appointed to the board afterwards. So I think there are still some issues. And also, if you look at those projects which Innovate UK, accessing some of the industrial strategies monies, again, you're still seeing the same imbalance, not just Scotland and UK, but Northern England. Now, the response of the UK government and Innovate UK is to say, we're trying to fund the things which will have the biggest impact, and we've got a lot of sympathy for that. But if you're doing it in such a way that it's not going to address the imbalance that's there, I understood that to be one of the fundamental aims of the industrial strategy. It's a bit of an overhang, and I could be wrong on this, but I thought it was an overhang from George Osborne's Northern Powerhouse to try and address that. So if you continue to funnel resources to areas of huge economic activity like the south east of England at the expense of, say, Northern England or Scotland or Wales, then you're not going to have the desired effect. So, and the best way for us to deal with that, certainly from the Scottish perspective, is to have that meaningful engagement. So if UK ministers, and that means not just Greg Clark, but other ministers, are willing to engage and speak with us, and also to give a level of control and discretion to, in our case, the Scottish Government to access and try and help direct some of that funding as well. You're going to get more bang for your bucks out of that. So that's the plea I've made to Greg Clark, and it's a plea I've made to the UK Government. Let's try and... I seem to get continual asked, will you cooperate with the UK Government industrial strategy? And I've said, I don't know how many times, of course we will, but it requires two to do that. So if it's the big opportunity that it's been promoted as, then let's try and make sure we get the most of it. And let's try and do it in a collaborative way.
Grateful. I know you've got to get away right about now, so we're very grateful. There's so many other questions we could have asked you, but we're grateful for your time, Cabinet Secretary. And if there's anything further that you feel you could meaningfully contribute to this inquiry, please make any submission to the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order, order. Yes, if we can, yeah.